There's a book that was removed from your Bible in the 4th century, a text that early Christians considered sacred scripture, that church fathers quoted as divine revelation, and then, suddenly, after councils met and votes were taken, it vanished, stripped from the canon, banned, hidden in monasteries for over 1,000 years. This is the Book of Jubilees, and what it says about human origins will change everything you thought you knew about where we came from. It describes creation not as divine words spoken into void, but as 22 specific engineering projects carried out according to pre-existing plans written on something called the Heavenly Tablets, records that existed before time itself began. And it describes beings called Watchers, who descended from the sky, took human wives, created hybrid offspring called Nephilim, taught forbidden knowledge, and contaminated human genetics so badly that a global flood was required to reset everything. And here's what makes your hands shake as you read this. 5,000 years ago in Sumer, ancient scribes were writing the exact same story in cuneiform on clay tablets. They called the beings Anunnaki instead of Watchers. They called the hybrid offspring by different names, but the sequence is identical. Beings from sky descending, mixing genetics with humans, creating a new species, teaching advanced knowledge, and then catastrophic flooding to eliminate the contamination and start over with a pure bloodline. Now here's where it gets impossible to dismiss as mythology. When modern scientists completed the Human Genome Project in 2003, they found something they still can't explain. 223 genes in human DNA that don't fit our evolutionary tree. Genes that appear nowhere in the progression from earlier primates. They just appear fully formed and functional. And the lead researchers called it horizontal gene transfer, because they couldn't say what they were really thinking, that these genes look inserted. Engineered. Exactly what Jubilees describes when it says, the Watchers mixed their seed with humans. And there's more. Geneticists have identified a population bottleneck around 12,000 years ago, when human numbers crashed to maybe 10,000 individuals worldwide, a near extinction event. And geologists have found evidence of catastrophic flooding at the exact same time. Ice core samples showing cosmic impact, sea levels rising hundreds of feet, megafauna going extinct. Everything pointing to the kind of global catastrophe that Jubilees and Sumerian tablets describe. And the dates match. The evidence matches. Ancient text and modern science are describing the same events in different languages, and that should terrify you or free you. I'm not sure which. Stop for a moment and feel what this means. Because if Jubilees is recording actual history, if the Watchers were real, if we're hybrids carrying genetics from two sources, if the flood actually happened as a reset to eliminate genetic contamination, then everything changes. Human origins become stranger than either religion or science admits. We're not purely evolved, and we're not purely created. We're engineered. We're the species that survived planetary catastrophe. We're the descendants of Noah, whose bloodline was chosen because it was genetically pure. And we carry in our DNA the memory of almost extinction, the evidence of intervention, the proof that someone designed us and then had to redesign us when the first version went wrong. And here's why this matters right now in your life. Because we're living at a convergence point. We're the generation that has both the ancient texts and the modern science. We can read what Jubilees says and then compare it with genetic data and archaeological findings and see that they match. We can trace the timeline from creation through contamination, through reset, through division, through knowledge preservation, and we can see that it all leads here, to now. To this moment when humanity scattered at Babel is reunifying through technology, when languages confused to keep us apart are being overcome by translation, when the division that was imposed to protect us is ending. And the question is whether we're ready, whether we've learned enough through our separation to handle unity wisely. or whether we're about to repeat the mistakes that required the flood in the first place. In this journey we're taking together, we're going to explore 7 chapters. First, we'll decode what Jubilees calls the beginning before the beginning, the heavenly tablets and the preparation phase that sounds exactly like planetary terraforming. Then we'll investigate the Watchers, who they were, what they taught, how their story matches Sumerian accounts of the Anunnaki. Then comes the flood. Not as mythology, but as documented catastrophe confirmed by geology and genetics. Then the division of Earth into territories that match modern genetic population distributions. Then Babel, where language was fractured to keep humanity separated. Then the bloodline from Abraham to Moses, preserving knowledge through the chaos. And finally, the Convergence. This moment right now, when ancient text and modern science recognize each other and shake hands. And here's what I promise you. If you stay until the end, if you follow the evidence through all 7 chapters, you'll see something that history has never dared to show you openly. You'll see a timeline that connects heaven and earth in ways that make both religion and science uncomfortable. You'll understand that myths are memories, that what we call supernatural might just be technology we didn't understand, that the line between ancient and advanced is thinner than you think. And if you're listening right now, wherever you are in the world, if something inside you knows the standard story doesn't quite fit,
If you've always sensed there's more to human origins than what they taught you in school or church,
then you're in the right place. And I'd invite you to subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the next journeys we're taking together. Because this is part 1 of 50 episodes exploring the hidden timeline, each one revealing another layer of evidence, another connection between ancient wisdom and modern discovery. But for now, settle in, let your breathing slow, because what we're about to explore together will take 2.5 hours, and every minute is building toward an understanding of who we really are, where we actually came from, and what that means for where we're going. The journey begins now. The timeline is waiting, and if you're ready to see what's been hidden, if you're brave enough to ask the questions they don't want you asking, then let's walk this path together into the mystery of who we really are. The truth is stranger than you imagine, and more important than you know. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The beginning before the beginning. You're standing in a place that exists outside of normal time, not physically, of course, but in your mind's eye. Let yourself go there completely. Close your eyes if you need to. You're in a vault carved deep into the mountains of Ethiopia, where the air is cool and smells of ancient parchment mixed with frankincense and stone dust that's been settling for centuries. The walls around you are thick enough to survive empires rising and falling outside, thick enough to protect what lies within from crusaders and colonizers, and the endless wars that rolled across these highlands. And before you, on a wooden table worn smooth by generations of monks' hands, rests a manuscript that most of the world has never seen. The pages are yellowed like old ivory, the edges are soft with age, and the ink has faded from black to brown, but the letters are still clear, still readable, written in Ge'ez, a language that lives now only in liturgy and in these preserved texts. You lean close enough to smell the faint mustiness of the parchment, close enough to see the tiny variations in the script where one scribe's hand differed from another's. And you notice your own breathing has slowed, has matched the silence of this place. And your fingers hover above the page, wanting to touch, but knowing you can't, because the moisture from your skin could erase letters that took months to form, letters that scribes believed were preserving the most important story ever told. And you begin to read the opening lines of the Book of Jubilees, and immediately, within the first paragraph, you feel something shift, because this isn't how Genesis tells the story. Genesis says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Simple, direct, mysterious. But Jubilees says something stranger. It says that before the beginning there was preparation, that before creation started there was planning, designing, organizing, that God showed Moses the heavenly tablets, records written before time itself began to exist. And you pause there, your eyes fixed on that phrase, heavenly tablets. And the vault suddenly feels smaller because this isn't poetic language, this isn't metaphor. This is describing documentation, records, blueprints, as if creation wasn't spontaneous divine speech, but careful implementation of a pre-existing design. And here's what makes your hands cold, even though the air isn't particularly cool. When you turn your head to the left where another manuscript lies open, a translation of Sumerian tablets from Mesopotamia written 3,000 years before Jubilees was compiled, you see them describing the exact same thing. The Anunnaki, planning Earth before arriving, holding councils in the heavens, making decisions about how to organize the planet. And they use the word tablet, too. Not metaphorically, but literally, describing clay records on which the design of creation was written. And you're standing between these two texts, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, and they're both telling you that creation wasn't a miracle spoken into instant existence, but a project carefully designed before implementation began. That someone made plans, kept records, followed procedures, and you realize with a chill that runs down your spine that you're looking at two witnesses describing the same event in different languages. And if that's true, if they're both preserving the same memory, then everything you were taught about the beginning might be incomplete, might be the simplified version, might be the story edited for people who weren't ready for the technical manual. Let's talk about what Jubilees actually says, because this is where it stops being vague religious language and starts sounding like something else entirely. The text describes 22 works of creation, not 7 days like Genesis simplifies it to, but 22 distinct engineering projects, and it lists them with the kind of detail you'd find in a project management document. First, the heavens were established. Not just created, but established, organized, given structure and hierarchy. Then the earth was formed, shaped from existing materials. Then the waters were gathered into their places, separated, organized. Then the firmament was set between waters above and waters below. Then dry land was called forth from the seas. Then vegetation was commanded to grow. Then the two great lights were placed in the firmament to govern day and night. Then stars were positioned for signs and seasons and years. Then the waters were told to bring forth living creatures. Then the earth brought forth animals, and finally humans. And as you read this sequence, you notice something. Each step uses language of commanding and organizing rather than creating from nothing. The waters were already there. They were just gathered. The earth was already there. It was just shaped. Life was already potential in the waters and soil. It was just brought forth, activated, initiated. And this language, this very specific language of organizing existing materials rather than speaking things into existence from void, this sounds exactly like terraforming, exactly like how we would describe taking a lifeless planet and making it suitable for habitation. Stop for a moment and feel what that means. If creation was organizing rather than conjuring, then the raw materials existed before the beginning. Matter and energy and the laws of physics were already there, and someone took those materials and arranged them, structured them, optimized them for life. And that someone had enough knowledge to plan it all out beforehand, to write it down on the heavenly tablets before starting. And you're holding your breath now because that idea, that possibility, it doesn't fit anywhere in the story you were told. It doesn't fit the Sunday school version where God speaks and galaxies appear, and it doesn't fit the pure materialist version where everything is random chance. It's something in between. Something that sounds like engineering, like science, like a project carried out by beings who understood planetary systems at a level we're only beginning to grasp. Here's where it gets specific enough to make you uncomfortable.
Jubilees says these 22 works were performed according to what was written on the heavenly tablets, and it uses language suggesting these tablets weren't just God's private notes, but accessible records. It says Moses was shown these tablets on Mount Sinai, that he was allowed to read them, to copy from them, that the entire Book of Jubilees is essentially Moses transcribing from pre-existing documentation. And think about what that implies. It implies there was a library, a repository,
a place where records of creation were stored and could be accessed by authorized individuals. And before you dismiss this as ancient people being poetic, consider what the Sumerians wrote about the same concept. They described something called the ME, which weren't just laws or rules, but the fundamental operating principles of reality itself. The ME of kingship, of priesthood, of agriculture, of warfare, of music, of metalworking. And these ME were described as being stored, as being transferable, as being something that could be stolen or given. And in one famous story, the goddess Inanna gets the god Enki drunk and steals some of these ME to bring them to her city, Uruk. And the text lists exactly what she took. 68 specific ME, including the ME of truth, of descent into the underworld, of lovemaking, of fear. And this isn't mythology where abstract concepts float around magically. This is describing information, coded information, stored information, transferable information, exactly what we would call a database, exactly what we would mean by operating code. Now, let's compare them directly. Because when you place Jubilees next to Sumerian creation accounts, the parallels become impossible to ignore. Jubilees says on the first day the heavens were created, and all the spirits who minister before God. Sumerian texts say, first the Anunnaki organized the heavens and established hierarchy among divine beings. Jubilees says on the second day the firmament was made to separate waters above from waters below. Sumerians describe Enlil separating An from Ki, heaven from earth, creating atmospheric space between them. Jubilees says on the third day waters were gathered and dry land appeared. Sumerians describe exactly this, saying Enki organized the Abzu, the primordial waters, and called forth land. Jubilees says vegetation came forth from the earth. Sumerians describe Enlil and Enki causing plants to sprout and cover the land. Jubilees says the great lights were placed in the sky to govern time. Sumerians describe celestial bodies being positioned to create the calendar. And both texts, both of them separated by language and culture and 1,000 years, describe these not as miracles, but as work, as tasks performed, as projects completed. The Hebrew word in Jubilees is malaka, which means work or skilled craft. The Sumerian texts use words meaning to build, to establish, to organize, not to speak into existence, but to construct systematically. And here's the detail that should stop you cold. Both texts describe the same sequence, and both show understanding of why that sequence was necessary. You can't have life without liquid water. You can't have complex life without land. You can't have sustainable ecosystems without a day-night cycle and seasons. You can't have advanced life without the Earth's specific tilt and orbit. And both texts demonstrate knowledge of these dependencies. They show understanding that creation had to follow a specific order because each stage prepared the conditions for the next stage. And that's not how mythology usually works. Mythology doesn't care about prerequisites. It doesn't care about the scientific order of planetary development. But engineering does. Science does. And these texts read like they were written by people who understood that you can't just magic a planet into habitability. You have to build it, layer by layer, system by system, exactly the way we now know it must be done. Your hands are cold now, even though the vault isn't, because you're realizing this isn't just ancient poetry. This is a procedure. This is a sequence. And someone followed it. And the result is Earth, is you, is every living thing that's ever drawn breath. And the question burning in your mind is who? Who had this knowledge? Who wrote these instructions?
Who carried them out with such precision that 5,000 years later, when we developed the science to understand planetary formation, we found that the ancient sequence was correct. Let's bring modern science into this, because what happened in the last century changes everything. In the 1950s, when scientists started seriously thinking about how life emerged on Earth, they developed what's called the abiogenesis sequence. First, you need a stable planet in the habitable zone of its star. Then, you need an atmosphere with the right composition and pressure. Then, you need liquid water, which requires specific temperature and pressure ranges. Then you need organic molecules, which form naturally under certain conditions. Then you need those molecules to organize into self-replicating systems, which is the definition of life. Then simple single-celled organisms. Then photosynthesis, which transforms the atmosphere. Then complex cells. Then multicellular life. Then plants. Then animals. Then intelligent species. And this sequence isn't arbitrary, it's necessary. Each stage creates the conditions for the next stage. And when exoplanet scientists started thinking about terraforming, about how we might make Mars or Venus habitable, they outlined essentially the same process. Establish atmosphere, create liquid water, introduce microbial life to begin transforming chemistry, introduce plants to produce oxygen, introduce animals. And that sequence, that scientifically necessary sequence for creating a habitable biosphere, matches what Jubilees describes, matches what Sumerian texts describe. And nobody's claiming ancient people understood modern astrobiology. But what if they were copying from records created by someone who did? What if the heavenly tablets and the Sumerian ME were documentation from a civilization that could engineer planets? And what if these scribes were faithfully preserving information they didn't fully understand, Copying the sequence accurately, even though the science behind it was beyond them? And here's something they don't teach you in school. In 1946, a Bedouin shepherd boy was looking for a lost goat near the Dead Sea. He threw a rock into a cave and heard pottery breaking. He climbed in and found clay jars, and inside those jars were scrolls, fragments of texts, including portions of the Book of Jubilees. And when carbon dating confirmed these fragments were 2,000 years old, older than any complete Bible manuscript we possess, scholars had to face something uncomfortable. Jubilees wasn't rejected by early church councils because it was a late forgery or a false text. It was removed because it was too detailed, too specific, too dangerous. Because it described creation in ways that made God sound less like a magician and more like an engineer. And apparently that wasn't the narrative they wanted people to have. There's something else in Jubilees that doesn't fit the mythology framework. It gives you numbers, exact numbers. It counts years and generations with the precision of someone keeping records, and scholars have calculated backwards through its timeline, and depending on which manuscript variant they use, they arrive at creation happening somewhere between 7,500 and 8,000 years ago. And here's where it gets interesting. Archaeologists have identified what they call the Neolithic Revolution, the moment when humans suddenly stopped being nomadic hunter-gatherers and started farming, building permanent settlements, developing writing and mathematics and astronomy. And this revolution happened, according to carbon dating and stratigraphic evidence, between 8,000 and 10,000 years ago, exactly the time frame Jubilees points to. And it didn't happen gradually. It happened suddenly, almost simultaneously in multiple locations around the world that had no contact with each other. The Fertile Crescent, the Indus Valley, the Yellow River in China, Mesoamerica, all within a few centuries of each other, all developing agriculture and architecture and complex society at the same time. And anthropologists have never fully explained why. Why, after 200,000 years of anatomically modern humans living as mobile hunters, suddenly, everywhere at once, we started farming and building cities and writing? Unless something changed, unless something was introduced. Unless the final stage that Jubilees describes, when humans were given knowledge and purpose and the spark of something beyond mere animal existence, unless that actually happened in a specific moment that we can still detect in the archaeological record. So what do we do with this? What does it mean if creation was planned, if there's documentation of that plan? If ancient texts might be preserving fragments of that documentation, even though the people who wrote them didn't fully understand what they were copying? Maybe it means we need to reconsider what we mean by the word divine. Maybe divine doesn't mean magical. Maybe it means advanced. Maybe it means operating on a level of knowledge and capability so far beyond ours that to people living in the Bronze Age, it was indistinguishable from supernatural power. Arthur C. Clarke said, "Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic." And maybe that's what we're looking at here. Maybe the heavenly tablets weren't mystical objects glowing with holy light, but actual physical records, data storage from a civilization that understood planetary engineering. And maybe what Jubilees calls angels and what Sumer calls Anunnaki were members of that civilization. Scientists, engineers, terraformers. And maybe they weren't breaking the laws of physics. They were using laws of physics we haven't discovered yet. Principles of energy and matter and space-time that our current science is still groping toward. And if that's true, then everything they left behind, the instructions they gave, the sequence they followed, the records they kept, all of it becomes not mythology, but history. Not poetry, but data. Not religion, but science we don't yet understand. And maybe the reason this makes people so uncomfortable, the reason Jubilees was banned, and the reason even now you feel a tightness in your chest reading about this, maybe it's because it removes the comfortable mystery. It takes away the safe ignorance of not knowing. It suggests we might actually be able to understand creation if we're willing to look at the evidence without filtering it through what we've been taught we're supposed to believe. And that's frightening, because mystery is safe. Mystery doesn't demand anything from us, but knowledge does, understanding does. If creation was planned, then we might be part of that plan. We might have a purpose that was designed into us. And that raises questions about free will, about destiny, about whether we're living our own lives or following programming we don't even know exists. Heavy questions, uncomfortable questions, the kind that follow you into sleep and wait for you in dreams. But here's the question that won't let you go. If creation was the implementation of a pre-existing plan documented on the heavenly tablets, then who wrote those tablets? Who designed the plan before the beginning? And were they working alone or following instructions from something even higher? Because Jubilees hints at layers, at hierarchy, at beings above the beings who did the actual work of creation. And the Sumerian texts describe the same structure. Anu at the top, giving orders. Enlil and Enki carrying out his will. Lower ranks of Anunnaki performing the labor. And this organizational chart of creation looks less like religion and more like a corporate flowchart. Less like worship and more like project management. And if you're ready to go deeper, if you're ready to meet the beings who came down to Earth to oversee what they'd built, if you're ready to learn what happened when 200 of them broke protocol and started interfering directly with humanity, then stay with me, because the next chapter goes into forbidden territory. We're going to Mount Hermon. We're going to stand on the mountain where, according to both Jubilees and the Book of Enoch, 200 beings called Watchers descended and made an oath so terrible it's recorded in 3 different ancient languages. We're going to see their names: Shemihazah, their leader, Azazel, who taught weapons, Arachiel, who taught signs of the earth, Ramiel, who taught astronomy. And we're going to learn exactly what they taught humanity: metallurgy for making swords,
astrology for predicting futures, root cutting for medicines and poisons, cosmetics for altering appearance. And we're going to ask why those specific technologies, why those particular gifts, and why both Jubilees and Sumerian tablets say this knowledge transfer was forbidden. Was contamination? Was genetic and cultural interference so severe it required a planetary reset, a global flood, a complete restart with only one family whose bloodline was still pure? And when you see the evidence side by side, when you read what both civilizations recorded about the Watchers and the Anunnaki, you'll understand why this chapter was cut from your Bible, why the Vatican didn't want you reading this, why the story of human origins had to be simplified and sanitized and stripped of the details that make it sound less like divine creation and more like genetic engineering. The vault is quiet now. Dust motes drift through the amber light. The manuscript of Jubilees lies open and patient, its words waiting the way truth always waits, and you can feel the next chapter pulling at you, the next layer of this mystery, and the silence has so much more to say. The Watchers are waiting on their mountain. Their story is the key to everything that follows. Shall we meet them? Shall we learn what they did, and why the world had to be drowned to undo it? The path continues, and you're already walking it. Let's see where it leads. Chapter 2. The Watchers. Those who descended from the sky. You're standing on Mount Hermon now, not the tourist version with paved paths and information plaques, but the ancient version, the one that existed 4,000 years ago when this mountain marked the boundary between three kingdoms and was considered the dwelling place of gods. The air here is thin, your lungs work harder with each breath, and the wind carries the scent of cedar and stone and something else, something older, a smell like ozone before a lightning strike. And you're at the exact spot that both the Book of Jubilees and the Book of Enoch describe with geographic precision, the place where 200 beings called Watchers descended from the sky and made an oath that would change human history forever. You can see for miles from here, south toward Jerusalem, west toward the Mediterranean, east toward Damascus, and you understand why they chose this place. It's a nexus, a crossing point, and in your hand, though you can't actually feel it, imagine you're holding a clay tablet, Sumerian, 4,000 years old, and it describes this same mountain, though it calls it by a different name, and it describes the same event, though it calls the participants Anunnaki instead of Watchers. And as you read both accounts side by side, Jubilees in one hand and the Sumerian text in the other, the wind picking up around you, you realize with a chill that has nothing to do with altitude that these aren't two different mythologies. These are two witnesses describing the same arrival, the same decision, the same moment when beings from somewhere else chose to break the fundamental rule they'd been given. Observe, but don't interfere. Watch, but don't touch. Guide, but don't contaminate. And they broke it spectacularly. Jubilees tells you their leader was named Shemahaza, and with him came 199 others, and it gives you some of their names: Azazel, Arakiel, Ramiel, Kokabio, Tamiel, Ramiel, Danel, and more. 20 chiefs listed by name, and each name meant something. Shemahaza means, "My name has seen." Azazel means, "God strengthens." But these weren't just names, they were titles, designations. And the text says they came down on Mount Hermon and they made a pact. They swore an oath binding themselves to each other, because what they were about to do was so forbidden, so dangerous, that each needed assurance the others wouldn't back out. And think about what that means. These were beings who understood consequences, who knew they were violating protocol, who felt fear, or at least uncertainty enough to require mutual commitment. They weren't mindless, they weren't operating on instinct, they were making a calculated decision to cross a line. And the text preserves the exact words of their oath.
Come, let us choose wives from among the daughters of men and beget children. And you stand there on that wind-swept mountain, and you try to imagine what that moment looked like. 200 beings, and the ancient texts describe them as luminous, as terrible in appearance, as unlike humans, but similar enough to interbreed, standing in a circle, speaking words that bound them to rebellion, and then descending to the valleys below, where human settlements clustered near water sources. And what happened next is described in both Jubilees and Sumerian tablets, with details too specific to be poetic invention. Stop and feel the weight of this moment. Because if this happened, if beings from somewhere else came to Earth and decided to mix their genetics with ours, then every assumption about human evolution, about our origins, about what we are, it shifts. It becomes something different.
Something that makes your hands shake a little as you stand on this mountain between past and present, between what you were taught and what the evidence suggests. And the wind is colder now. Or maybe it's just you. Maybe it's the realization that you're standing at ground zero of the event that determined what humanity would become. Here's what Jubilees says happened next. And as you read this, remember that the Sumerian tablets describe the same sequence with different vocabulary. The Watchers descended and took human women as wives, and these unions produced offspring, and the text calls these offspring Nephilim, which in Hebrew means the fallen ones, or those who cause others to fall. And it describes them as giants, as mighty men, as beings of renown, but not in an admiring way, more like a warning, like calling something powerful and dangerous. And the Sumerian version agrees. It describes the Anunnaki interbreeding with humans and producing a hybrid species. And the Sumerian king list, that ancient document that records every ruler of every city before and after the flood, it lists kings who ruled for impossible lengths of time, 28,000 years, 36,000 years. And then, after the flood, the numbers drop to realistic human lifespans. And scholars have argued for centuries about what this means. Were they counting differently? Were the numbers symbolic? But what if they were simply recording what they observed? What if the pre-flood rulers were these hybrids, these Nephilim, beings with extended lifespans, inherited from their non-human parents? And what if the flood was specifically designed to eliminate them, to reset human genetics to baseline? But here's what makes this more than mythology. Here's where ancient text meets modern science in a way that should make you deeply uncomfortable. In 2003, the Human Genome Project completed the first full mapping of human DNA, and scientists found something they still can't fully explain. 223 genes that appear in humans but don't appear in any of our supposed evolutionary ancestors. Genes that have no clear pathway from earlier primates. They just appear, fully formed and functional. And these aren't junk genes, they're active. They code for important things: immune functions, brain development, cellular repair. And the lead researchers published papers with very careful language saying these genes might have been acquired through horizontal gene transfer, which is scientific speak for we don't know where they came from. And when you read what Jubilees says, that the Watchers mixed their seed with human women, when you read what Sumer says, that the Anunnaki combined their essence with primitive humans to create Adamu, the worker, suddenly those mystery genes stop being a puzzle and start being evidence. Evidence of exactly what these texts describe: genetic intervention, hybridization, the insertion of non-human DNA into the human genome. Picture yourself in that laboratory, fluorescent lights humming overhead, computer screens displaying gene sequences in colored bars, and imagine being the scientist who first noticed these anomalous genes, who ran the comparisons over and over, expecting to find the error. And there was no error. The genes were there. They were human. They were in all of us. But they didn't come from where human genes are supposed to come from. And you couldn't publish that they might be evidence of ancient genetic engineering because that would end your career. So you used careful academic language about horizontal transfer and left it at that. But the question remained burning in the back of your mind during coffee breaks and sleepless nights. Where did they come from? Now let's talk about what the Watchers taught humanity, because this is where both Jubilees and the Book of Enoch get specific in ways that are almost uncomfortable to read.
Azazel taught men to make swords and knives and shields and breastplates. He taught them metallurgy, the art of working metal, which prior to this humans didn't have. Shemahaza taught enchantments and root cutting, which means pharmacology, the use of plants for medicine and poison. Arachiel taught the signs of the earth, which is geology, understanding of minerals and earthquakes and the structure of the planet. Ramiel taught astronomy, the movements of stars and planets and how to predict celestial events. Kokabil taught astrology, the idea that celestial movements affect earthly events. Tamiel taught the seeing of stars, which might be telescopy or advanced observation. And Asaradel taught the course of the moon. And these aren't random bits of knowledge. These are specific technologies. And when you list them together, you see a pattern. Weapons for warfare, metals for tools and weapons, plants for altering consciousness and healing, earth sciences for mining and construction, astronomy for navigation and calendars. These are the exact technologies needed to jumpstart civilization, to move from Stone Age to Bronze Age, to go from scattered tribes to organized kingdoms. And both Jubilees and Enoch say these teachings were forbidden, were contamination, were things humans weren't supposed to have yet, or maybe ever. And here's what archaeology shows. Around 8,000 years ago, right in the window where Jubilees places these events, there's a sudden explosion of technology. Copper working appears almost simultaneously in the Middle East, the Balkans, and Southeast Asia. Agriculture intensifies dramatically. Monumental architecture begins with sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, which was built by people who supposedly didn't even have pottery yet. They built a massive temple complex with stones weighing 16 tons, carved with sophisticated reliefs. And they did this before developing farming, which is backwards. It's the wrong order. You're supposed to develop agriculture first, then surplus food, then specialization, then architecture. But here they built the temple first, as if the knowledge came before the development, as if someone taught them. And there's more. Written language appears suddenly in Sumer, not gradually evolving from simple marks to complex script, but appearing fully formed, with grammar and syntax. Cuneiform just shows up complete, and the Sumerians themselves said it was a gift from the gods, from the Anunnaki. They never claimed to have invented it. They said it was taught to them. Your hands are cold again, and this time it's not the mountain wind. It's the implication settling into your bones. What if the Watchers and the Anunnaki are the same beings described by different cultures? What if they really did come down and teach humanity technologies we weren't supposed to have? And what if the reason it was forbidden wasn't divine jealousy, but biological protocol? What if there's a natural timeline for species development and they interfered with it, accelerated it, contaminated it, and the results were catastrophic? Let's compare the accounts directly because the parallels are too specific to dismiss. Jubilee says the Watchers took human wives, and their offspring were giants, who consumed all the resources of humans and then started consuming humans themselves. They taught warfare and weapons, and humanity became violent. Sumerian texts say the Anunnaki created humans as workers, but then some Anunnaki interbred with them, and the hybrid population grew too large, too numerous, too noisy, and the gods regretted making them. Both texts describe a world spiraling into chaos because of this interbreeding.
Both describe the offspring as powerful but corrupt. Both describe humanity learning things that made them dangerous. And both describe the highest authority, the one above the Watchers, the one above the Anunnaki, making a decision. This experiment has failed.
It needs to be reset. The contamination needs to be purged, and the method chosen was water. A global flood. Kill everything. Save one family whose genetics were still pure, and start over. And here's what geology and genetics show. There's evidence of catastrophic flooding at the end of the Younger Dryas period, approximately 11,800 years ago. Ice core samples show massive freshwater input into the oceans. Sea levels rose hundreds of feet in a geologically instantaneous time frame. Megafauna across the planet went extinct. Mammoths, giant sloths, saber-toothed cats. Over 35 genera of large mammals disappeared. And human population crashed. Geneticists can see it in our DNA. A bottleneck. A moment when human numbers dropped so low that all living humans today descend from a small population that survived this event. Estimates range from 2,000 to 10,000 individuals. And this bottleneck shows up in mitochondrial DNA, which is passed through the maternal line, and in Y chromosome DNA, which passes through the paternal line. And both show the same timing. Something almost wiped us out around 12,000 years ago, exactly when Jubilees and Sumerian tablets say the flood happened. There's something else, something they found in caves in Romania and Siberia that didn't make mainstream news but should have. DNA evidence of archaic human species we didn't know existed, Denisovans, and something else they haven't named yet. And modern humans have genetic markers from these species. We carry their DNA. 2%, 3%. Small amounts, but detectable. And the only way that happens is through interbreeding. And these weren't Neanderthals who we know about. These were something else. And they lived in the same time frame as the Watchers' story. And then they disappeared. Went extinct, or were absorbed into the human population. But they left genetic traces. And you stand there, wondering if those traces are what's left of the Nephilim. If that small percentage of mystery DNA is the remnant of whatever the Watchers created when they mixed their genetics with ours. So what does it mean if the Watchers were real? If genetic engineering happened in our deep past? If what we call mythology is actually memory preserved through generations that didn't have the vocabulary to describe what they witnessed, except in terms of gods and angels and divine beings? Maybe it means we need to reconsider the whole framework. Maybe the line between natural and supernatural is an illusion. Maybe what ancient people called supernatural was just technology they didn't understand. And maybe the real question isn't whether the Watchers existed, but what they were. Were they extraterrestrial? Were they a previous terrestrial civilization that achieved technology we're only now approaching? Were they time travelers? Were they interdimensional? And maybe the answer is, we don't have enough information to know. All we have are the accounts, the genetic anomalies, the archaeological mysteries, the sudden unexplained jumps in human capability, and the flood evidence. And we can either dismiss all of it as coincidence, or we can sit with the uncomfortable possibility that human origins are more complex than either religion or conventional science admits. And maybe that's okay. Maybe not knowing is where wisdom begins. Maybe the willingness to say, I don't know, but let's look at the evidence, is more valuable than clinging to comfortable stories that don't quite fit the data. And if the Watchers did come down, if they did teach us and breed with us and contaminate the experiment, then their legacy is us. We are the result. We are the species that survived the reset, and we carry in our DNA both the baseline human and whatever else was added. And that makes us something unique, something that wasn't planned, something that emerged from chaos and contamination and cosmic rebellion. And maybe that's why we're so strange. Why we're the only species that looks at the stars and wonders where we came from. Why we're the only ones who build and destroy and build again. Why we can't seem to decide if we're animals or angels. Maybe it's because we're both. Maybe we're the hybrid species, the children of watchers and humans. And we've been trying to figure out what that means ever since. The weight of that sits heavy in your chest, not painful but present, like carrying something precious and fragile. And the mountain wind picks up, and somewhere below in the valleys, human cities sprawl, descendants of the survivors, carriers of the mixed genetics. And you wonder what the Watchers would think if they could see what we've become. But if the Watchers contaminated humanity through genetics and knowledge, if the world became so corrupted that a reset was necessary, then what happened next is the most important part of the story. Because both Jubilees and Sumerian tablets describe the same solution. One man was chosen, one family was warned, one seed stock of pure human genetics was preserved, while everything else was destroyed by water. And the details are too specific to be independent invention. Jubilees says Noah was chosen because in his generations he was perfect. Which doesn't mean morally perfect, but genetically pure. His genealogy was uncorrupted. And the Sumerian tablets say the same thing about Ziusudra. He was chosen because his bloodline was clean. And both texts give you the dimensions of the boat. Both tell you how long the flood lasted. Both describe the same sequence of waters rising and covering the earth and then receding. And both describe what happened after, how the earth was divided among the survivors, how new boundaries were drawn, how civilization was rebuilt but differently, more carefully, with controls in place. And that's where we're going next, into the flood itself. Not as divine punishment for generic sin, but as biological quarantine, as planetary decontamination protocol, as the moment when someone decided the only way to save the human experiment was to kill almost everything and start over with clean samples. And we're going to look at the geological evidence, the genetic evidence, the archaeological evidence of a global catastrophe that science confirms happened exactly when these ancient texts say it happened. And we're going to ask the hardest question. If the flood was meant to eliminate the Nephilim, if it was meant to reset human genetics to baseline, then did it work? Or are we still carrying the contamination? Are we still the hybrid species? And is that why the story feels so urgent, so personal? Because it's not ancient history. It's us. It's what we are, right now, sitting with the question of whether we're the mistake that was supposed to be erased or the miracle that survived against all odds. The mountain is quiet now. The wind has died down, and the sun is setting over the Mediterranean, casting long shadows across the stone. And you can feel the next chapter pulling at you. The flood is coming. The reset is inevitable. And one family is about to be saved while the world drowns. Shall we meet them? Shall we learn why Noah mattered? Shall we see what it means to be chosen when everything else is being destroyed? The water is rising, and the story continues. Let's see what survives. Chapter 3. The Flood. Resetting Humanity. You're standing in a museum now, the British Museum in London, though you could be in the Louvre or the Iraq Museum, or any of a dozen places where ancient tablets are preserved behind glass. The air here is temperature-controlled, humidity regulated, everything designed to prevent further decay of objects that have already survived thousands of years. And before you is a clay tablet about the size of your hand, covered in cuneiform so small you need to lean close to see the individual wedge marks pressed into the clay when it was still wet. This is Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh, sometimes called the Flood Tablet, and it was discovered in the ruins of Nineveh in 1853 by Hormuzd Rassam, digging through the library of Ashurbanipal. And when it was finally translated 20 years later by George Smith, a young assistant at the museum, he became so excited that he reportedly ran around the room tearing off his clothes, because what he'd just read was a flood story nearly identical to Noah's flood, but written in Akkadian, copied from even older Sumerian sources, predating the Hebrew Bible by over 1,000 years. And the hero's name wasn't Noah, it was Utnapishtim. And the God who warned him wasn't Yahweh, it was Enki. But the story, the structure, the details, they matched too closely to be coincidence. Now turn your head to the right. Imagine another display case. Inside is a page from the Book of Jubilees. Not the original because that doesn't exist, but a medieval Ethiopian copy preserving text that goes back 2,000 years, and it tells the same story again. Different name, different language, same event. And on the wall between these two displays, imagine a third text, the Atrahasis epic, even older than Gilgamesh, describing the same global flood with the same solution. And you're standing in the center of this triangle of evidence. 3 ancient civilizations separated by time and geography, none of them in contact with each other when these texts were written, and all 3 describing the same catastrophe with the same cause. Humanity became too numerous, too corrupt, too contaminated, and the solution was water. Drown everything, save one family, restart. Stop here and feel what this means, because if 3 independent sources describe the same global catastrophe, either they're all making up the same story for some reason, or they're all preserving memory of something that actually happened. Something so traumatic, so species-defining, that every civilization that survived it passed down the account. And you're looking at the evidence. You're seeing the clay and parchment and ink. And your breath catches a little because this isn't theoretical anymore. This is documented. This is recorded in materials you can touch. And the question isn't whether they wrote about a flood. They clearly did. The question is whether the flood was real, whether it happened the way they describe, and whether the reason they give, genetic contamination from the watchers interbreeding with humans, whether that reason makes sense of evidence we're still finding today. The museum is quiet, except for the whisper of air circulation. Footsteps of other visitors echo on polished floors, and you lean closer to the Gilgamesh tablet, close enough to see the ancient fingerprint of the scribe who shaped this clay. And you read the words that George Smith read, the words that made him tear his clothes in excitement. For 6 days and 7 nights the wind blew. The flood and tempest overwhelmed the land. When the 7th day arrived, the tempest and flood which had fought like an army began to cease. The sea grew quiet. The storm abated. The flood stopped. I looked at the weather. Silence reigned, and all of humanity had turned to clay. And your hands are trembling slightly as you realize this isn't mythology written in flowery, poetic language. This is someone describing what they saw, what they survived, what they remembered. Let's compare these accounts directly, because when you line them up, the parallels become impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Jubilees says Noah was chosen because in his generation he was perfect in his ways. The Hebrew word is tamim, which doesn't mean morally perfect but complete, unblemished, genetically pure. His genealogy wasn't mixed with the Nephilim bloodlines, and God tells Noah to build an ark, and gives exact dimensions: 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high, with 3 levels, and to cover it with pitch inside and out. Now look at what the Sumerian version says. Enki warns Utnapishtim that the gods have decided to flood the earth because humanity has become too noisy, too numerous, and he tells him to build a boat. And the dimensions given are different. It's described as a cube, but it has multiple levels and is sealed with bitumen, which is pitch, and the purpose is identical. Save yourself, save your family, save representatives of every animal species. Now look at Jubilees again. It says, the flood came because the earth was corrupted by the offspring of the Watchers. The Nephilim had filled the land with violence and had taught humans forbidden knowledge, and God regretted making humans and decided to destroy everything except Noah, whose genealogy was pure. Same cause, same solution,
same survival plan. Here's where it gets specific in ways that should make you deeply uncomfortable if you still think this is just mythology. All three accounts give you the duration of the flood. Jubilees says the waters rose for 40 days and the flood lasted 150 days before the waters began to recede. Genesis, which draws from Jubilees, says the same thing. The Gilgamesh epic says 6 days and 7 nights of storm, followed by the waters covering everything. Slight variation in the storm duration, but agreement on total flooding. All three tell you the ark landed on a mountain. Jubilees says Mount Lubar, which is in the Ararat range. Genesis says Ararat. Gilgamesh says Mount Nemush, which is also in that region. Same mountain range, same geographic location. And all three describe the survivor sending out birds to test whether the waters had receded. Noah sends a raven and then a dove 3 times. Utnapishtim sends a dove, then a swallow, then a raven. Same method, same purpose.
Testing for dry land. But here's what changes everything. Here's where ancient text meets modern science, and they shake hands. Geologists have found evidence of catastrophic flooding at the end of the Younger Dryas period, approximately 11,800 years ago. Something caused rapid, massive ice sheet collapse. Sea levels rose between 300 and 400 feet in a geologically instantaneous time frame. We're talking years, not millennia. Coastal areas worldwide were inundated, and the evidence is everywhere once you know to look for it. Underwater ruins off the coast of India, Japan, the Mediterranean, structures that were built on dry land that are now 30 meters underwater. The Black Sea deluge hypothesis proposes that the Mediterranean broke through the Bosphorus and flooded the Black Sea basin in a catastrophic event that would have seemed like the end of the world to anyone living in that region. And carbon dating places this event around 5400 BCE. And there's more. Ice core samples from Greenland and Antarctica show a distinct layer at the Younger Dryas boundary containing cosmic dust, microspherules, and platinum anomalies suggesting extraterrestrial impact, multiple airbursts or impacts from a fragmenting comet. And the thermal effects would have been catastrophic, instantly melting massive amounts of ice. The resulting meltwater would have poured into the oceans, causing exactly the kind of flooding these ancient texts describe. Picture yourself as a geologist in Greenland drilling ice cores. Each layer is a year. You can count them like tree rings, and you reach the layer from 11,800 years ago. And it's different. It's black with cosmic dust. It contains microscopic diamonds that only form under extreme heat and pressure. It contains platinum at levels 300 times normal background levels. And you run the tests again, because this can't be right. But it is. Something from space hit Earth at this exact moment. Multiple impacts across North America, and the heat was enough to melt ice sheets, to start continental-scale wildfires, to cause a climate catastrophe. And when you publish your findings, other scientists confirm it. They find the same layer in different ice cores, in sediment cores from lakes, in archaeological sites where there's a distinct boundary. Below it, you have megafauna and human artifacts. Above it, you have massive die-off and population collapse. And the timing matches. It matches when Jubilees places the flood. It matches when Sumerian king lists show a break between pre-flood and post-flood dynasties. It matches when genetics shows a human population bottleneck. Let's talk about that genetic bottleneck, because this is where it becomes personal. This is where ancient catastrophe touches your DNA directly. Every human alive today descends from a small population that survived an extinction-level event. Geneticists can see it in mitochondrial DNA, which passes from mother to child. They can trace all living humans back to a woman they call mitochondrial Eve, who lived somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 years ago. But that's not the bottleneck we're talking about. There's another one, more recent, sharper. Around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, the human population crashed. Estimates vary, but the breeding population may have dropped to as low as 2,000 individuals. Some studies suggest even fewer. And this bottleneck shows up in both mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome DNA, which passes from father to son, meaning both maternal and paternal lines show the same crash at the same time. And when you map the genetic diversity of modern humans compared to other species, we're remarkably uniform. Chimpanzees, who number far fewer than humans, have more genetic diversity than we do. We're all much more closely related than we should be if we'd been breeding in stable, large populations for hundreds of thousands of years. We're related like we all descended from a small group of survivors. And there's something else in the genetic data that connects to the Watcher story in a way that makes your skin prickle. Remember those 223 mystery genes we talked about? The ones that don't fit our evolutionary tree. Some geneticists have proposed that a small percentage of human DNA shows evidence of archaic admixture, meaning we interbred with other human species, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and possibly others we haven't identified. But here's the strange part. This admixture happened before the bottleneck, and after the bottleneck the percentages are different, lower, more uniform, as if whatever diversity existed in the pre-flood population was reduced, filtered, and what came through the bottleneck was more genetically similar. And if you're thinking this sounds exactly like what Jubilees describes, that Noah was chosen because his genealogy was pure, that the flood eliminated the Nephilim and their mixed genetics, and only the uncorrupted human baseline survived, you're thinking what a growing number of researchers are thinking but can't say publicly without risking their careers. Your hands are cold as you stand in that museum, even though the temperature is carefully controlled, because you're holding in your mind two sets of data. Ancient texts saying genetic contamination required a reset, and modern genetics showing a population crash that reduced diversity and eliminated certain genetic lines. And they match. They point to the same event, and the question burning in your mind is whether this was natural disaster or deliberate intervention, whether the comet impacts were random cosmic bad luck or whether someone triggered them, whether the flood was unfortunate catastrophe or necessary quarantine. And you can't know. The evidence doesn't go that far. But what you can know is that something nearly wiped out humanity 12,000 years ago, and the survivors, that small population that made it through, they told their children what happened, and those children told their children, and the story traveled through generations and across continents until it was written down in Sumer, in Akkadian, in Hebrew, in dozens of languages, and the core remained the same. There was corruption, there was contamination, there was a decision made at the highest level. Destroy everything and start over with clean samples. And one family was saved. There's one more piece of evidence, one more thing they found that ties this together in a way that's almost too perfect. Archaeologists excavating in Mesopotamia, in the ancient cities of Ur and Shuruppak and others, they found a layer, a distinct geological layer of water-deposited silt, 8 feet thick in some places, and above this layer, the civilization is different. Pottery changes, building techniques change, even the language shifts, and below the layer is older civilization. And the layer itself contains no artifacts, no human remains, nothing, just sterile flood silt. And this layer appears in multiple cities across the region, and when they carbon dated it, the dates cluster around 3000 BCE, give or take a few centuries depending on location and method. Now that's more recent than the Younger Dryas event, but what if there were multiple floods? What if the cosmic impacts triggered climate chaos that caused flooding in pulses over thousands of years? Or what if the texts are conflating multiple events into one narrative? Or what if the Mesopotamian flood layer is evidence of a regional catastrophe that survivors associated with older racial memory of the bigger global event? We don't know.
But the layer is there, undeniable, physical evidence that catastrophic flooding happened in the exact region where these texts were written. So what does it mean if the flood was real? If it wasn't just a moral tale about divine punishment for wickedness, but an actual historical event caused by genetic contamination that required planetary reset? Maybe it means we need to stop thinking of ancient texts as primitive superstition and start treating them as data, as preserved observations from people who witnessed things we can now verify through geology and genetics. Maybe it means the line between myth and history is blurrier than we thought. Maybe myths are how pre-scientific people recorded scientific observations. They didn't have the vocabulary for genetic engineering, so they said the sons of God took human wives. They didn't have the framework for cosmic impact winter, so they said God opened the windows of heaven and the fountains of the deep. But they were describing real events using the only language available to them. And maybe the flood story endures. Maybe it appears in over 200 cultures worldwide, not because it's a good story, but because it's true, because it happened, because every group of survivors passed down the memory and it became foundational to their understanding of who they are. We are the ones who survived. We are the descendants of the family that was saved when everything else drowned. We carry that survival in our DNA, in our collective memory, in our stories. And maybe that's why the story feels so urgent even now, why it resonates so deeply. Because it's not ancient history, it's family history. It's the story of our near extinction and improbable survival. The weight of this sits in your chest like a stone, heavy but grounding. Because if we almost went extinct once, if we were reduced to a few thousand individuals clinging to survival while the world drowned, then we're more fragile than we like to think. We're more connected than we like to admit. We're all cousins, all descended from the same small group of survivors. And every difference we fight over, race and nationality and religion, they're all surface variations on the same genetic baseline. We're all Noah's children. We all carry the memory of the flood, whether we know it or not. And maybe that should change how we treat each other. Maybe that should make us more careful with this planet that nearly killed us once before. But here's the question that won't let you go as you stand in that museum looking at flood tablets from 3 different civilizations. If the flood was meant to eliminate the Nephilim, if it was meant to reset human genetics to baseline and remove the contamination from watcher interbreeding, then did it work? Because Jubilees says something troubling. It says that after the flood, after the waters receded, and Noah's family emerged and began to repopulate the earth, the watchers were still there, bound and imprisoned, according to the text. But their offspring, some of their offspring, the text hints that not all the Nephilim died, that some survived, or that the genetic contamination persisted in the survivor population. And that's where we're going next. Into the immediate post-flood world, into the moment when Noah's 3 sons divided the entire earth among themselves with geographic precision that shouldn't be possible for Bronze Age people. Into the mystery of how civilization rebuilt so quickly, too quickly, how suddenly there were cities and agriculture and writing and mathematics appearing almost simultaneously in multiple locations, as if someone was teaching. As if the knowledge the watchers had given was preserved and passed down despite the flood. And we're going to look at what Jubilees records about this division of Earth, because it gives coordinates, it gives boundaries, it describes territories with accuracy that matches modern genetic population distributions, and it raises the question of whether Noah's sons were following a plan, whether they had maps or instructions, or whether they were being guided by something. And we're going to ask why ancient megalithic structures, pyramids, ziggurats, massive stone complexes, why they all date to this exact post-flood period, why they appear suddenly without apparent development, as if someone who survived the flood had knowledge of engineering and astronomy and mathematics and was rebuilding what had been destroyed, carefully, deliberately, according to some design. The museum is closing. Lights are dimming. The guard is walking through asking people to head toward the exits. But the tablets remain, their words pressed into clay 4,000 years ago, describing events that happened 7,000 years before that. And the story continues. The flood is over. The waters have receded. One family has survived. And now comes the rebuilding, the division, the question of what humanity becomes after reset, and whether we learned anything from nearly going extinct. Shall we continue? Shall we see how the world was divided and why it matters? The water is gone, but the memory remains. Let's see what comes next. Chapter 4. Dividing the Earth, the Post-Catastrophe Map. You're standing in a room that doesn't officially exist, or at least that's how it feels, deep in the archives beneath the Vatican Library, where scholars with special permission study texts the public never sees. The air here is dry, precisely controlled to preserve parchments and codices that have survived since the early church fathers walked the earth. And before you, on a lectern carved from ancient wood, rests a manuscript of Jubilees. Not the Ethiopian version you saw before, but a Latin translation made by a monk in the 6th century before the text was officially suppressed. And you're reading a section that makes the hair on your arms stand up. Chapter 8, where it describes in meticulous detail how Noah's 3 sons divided the entire earth among themselves, not metaphorically, not symbolically, but with actual geographic boundaries, cardinal directions, landmarks, territories assigned with the precision of a legal land deed, and the text gives you coordinates. It tells you Shem received the middle of the earth, the lands from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. Japheth received the north, including Europe and the lands beyond. Ham received the south, including Africa, and the lands toward the setting sun. And these aren't vague, poetic descriptions. These are specific territorial assignments with borders defined by rivers and mountains and seas. And you're thinking, this is impossible. How would Bronze Age people have this kind of geographic knowledge? How would they know the shape of continents, the extent of land masses, unless they had maps, unless someone gave them instructions, unless this division was planned? Now imagine, beside this manuscript you have another document, a modern genetic population map showing human Y chromosome haplogroup distributions, the kind of map scientists create by sampling DNA from populations worldwide and tracing paternal lineages. And you lay the ancient text next to the modern map, and something impossible happens. They match. The territories Jubilees assigns to Shem's descendants correspond almost exactly to where haplogroup J is concentrated: Middle East, Caucasus, Mediterranean. The territories assigned to Japheth correspond to where haplogroups R and I dominate: Europe, Central Asia. The territories assigned to Ham correspond to haplogroups A and E, Africa and parts of the ancient Near East. And you're staring at these two maps, one written 3,000 years ago describing events from 7,000 years ago, one created last decade using cutting-edge genetic science, and they're telling the same story. Humanity spread from a single point after a population bottleneck and divided into 3 main branches that settled in specific geographic regions. And the ancient text knew this. It recorded this with accuracy that shouldn't be possible. Stop and feel the weight of what you're looking at. Because if Jubilees correctly describes genetic population distributions that we only discovered through DNA analysis in the 21st century, then either this is the luckiest guess in human history, or whoever wrote this text had access to information they shouldn't have had. Knowledge of human migration patterns, of genetic inheritance, of global geography. And the text itself says this division wasn't random. It says the sons of Noah cast lots, but lots guided by divine instruction. It says boundaries were drawn, and inheritances assigned, and oaths were sworn not to encroach on each other's territories. And you're thinking, this sounds less like primitive tribes wandering randomly, and more like a carefully managed repopulation program. Like someone was directing the survivors, telling them where to go, how to spread out, ensuring genetic diversity would be maintained while keeping populations separated enough to develop independently. The archive is silent, except for your own breathing and the faint creak of ancient wood. Somewhere above you, tourists are taking photos of the Sistine Chapel, completely unaware that beneath their feet lies evidence that human history is far stranger than the official narrative admits. And your hands hover over the manuscript, not quite touching, afraid somehow that contact might make this disappear, might prove it's just a dream. But it's not. It's real. It's written in careful Latin script, translated from Hebrew, translated from something older. And the words are clear, and the implications are staggering. And you can feel something shifting in your understanding of who we are and where we came from. Let's look at exactly what Jubilees says, because the detail is precise enough to make you uncomfortable. Chapter 8, verse 11 through 30, gives you the complete territorial division. Shem receives the land from the Persian Gulf, which the text calls the tongue of the sea that looks toward Egypt, extending to the Mediterranean, including the mountains of Ashur, and all the land of Elam, and the land of Aram, and the whole land of Jordan. And it lists rivers, the Tigris, the Euphrates, boundaries that correspond exactly to the Fertile Crescent, where civilization first emerged after the flood, where Sumer and Akkad and Babylon would rise, where agriculture was reinvented, where writing appeared, where the first cities were built, and the text says this was Shem's portion. This was where his descendants were assigned to settle. And when you look at genetic data, populations in this region do share common paternal ancestry. They do cluster together as a distinct group. Haplogroup J, which originated somewhere in the Middle East and spread from there. Now look at what it says about Japheth. He receives the land toward the north from the Mediterranean, extending to the river Tina, which flows toward the northeast, and beyond that, all the lands of Gog and Magog, and northward to the waters above the world. And this description matches Europe and Central Asia, the territories where Indo-European peoples spread, where haplogroups R1a and R1b dominate, and archaeologists have traced the expansion of these populations from a homeland somewhere in the steppes, spreading west into Europe and south into India and Persia. And it happened in waves over thousands of years, but the endpoint matches what Jubilees describes. Japheth's descendants in the north and west, and the text even mentions islands, the Isles of the Gentiles, which could be Greece, could be Mediterranean islands, could be Britain, and all of these regions are indeed populated by descendants of the genetic branch that split north from the Middle Eastern source population. And Ham receives the south. The text says his portion extends from the Red Sea to the Nile, and beyond that, all the land of the setting sun, which is west, which is Africa. And it includes Arabia and parts of Canaan. And again, genetic data confirms that African populations and Arabian populations do share ancestry patterns distinct from European and Middle Eastern groups, haplogroups A, B, E, which are most common in Africa and parts of the Arabian Peninsula. And the split between these lineages and the Eurasian lineages dates to roughly the same period as the post-flood repopulation would have occurred if you accept the timeline Jubilees gives, somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 years ago. But here's where it gets strange. Here's where the text reveals something that shouldn't be possible for ancient writers to know. Jubilees says that after the division was made, after territories were assigned, the sons of Noah were shown the boundaries by an angel, and the angel had books, records, and he showed them where to go, and they wrote it down. And the text says these assignments were recorded in the heavenly tablets we've talked about before, meaning this division wasn't arbitrary. It was planned. It was part of the same documentation that described creation. And think about what that implies. It implies there was a repopulation plan, a strategy for how to rebuild human civilization after near extinction, where different genetic lines should settle to maximize diversity and minimize conflict. And someone,
something, had this plan ready before the flood even ended. Picture yourself as an anthropologist studying human migration patterns. You have genetic data, archaeological evidence, linguistic distributions, and you're building models of how humans spread across the globe after the last ice age. And your models show three main branches, one staying in the Middle East and North Africa, one spreading into Europe and Central Asia, one moving into sub-Saharan Africa, and eventually to other continents. And the split dates to approximately 10,000 years ago, and you publish your findings. And then someone shows you Chapter 8 of Jubilees, and you read it, and your skin goes cold, because this ancient text describes exactly what your genetic models show. 3 branches, same geographic distributions, same approximate timing. And you have to choose whether to acknowledge this correlation or ignore it, because acknowledging it raises questions you're not prepared to answer, questions about how ancient people could know things they discovered through DNA testing. There's something else in Jubilees that connects to archaeological evidence in ways that are almost too perfect. The text says that after the division was established, after the sons of Noah went to their assigned territories, they began to build. And it specifies that Shem's line built first in the east, and archaeological evidence shows that the earliest post-flood civilizations emerged in Mesopotamia, Sumer rising around 4500 BCE, developing cuneiform writing, building cities like Uruk and Ur, creating the first complex urban societies, and then, slightly later, civilization appears in the Indus Valley, Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, around 3300 BCE, sophisticated planned cities with advanced drainage systems and standardized weights and measures. And then Egypt, pyramids and hieroglyphs, and the Old Kingdom around 3100 BCE, and then, slightly later, the Yellow River civilization in China. And what's strange is how similar they all are in certain fundamental ways. They all develop writing within a few centuries of each other. They all build monumental architecture. They all have advanced mathematics and astronomy. They all use similar agricultural techniques. And they all emerge suddenly, not gradually. There's no slow evolution from simple to complex. They appear fully formed, as if someone who already knew how to build civilization was teaching multiple groups simultaneously. Your hands are shaking now as you hold this thought. Because if the division of Earth was managed, if survivors of the flood carried knowledge and were directed where to settle and what to build, then these sudden, simultaneous civilizations make sense. They're not independent inventions. They're implementations of the same template by different genetic populations in different geographic regions. And the template came from before the flood, from the knowledge the Watchers had taught, from the heavenly tablets that survived, from whatever remnant of the previous world made it through the catastrophe. And this is why Jubilees was banned, because it describes human civilization not as gradual evolution from primitive to advanced, but as recovery, as rebuilding, as people who once had knowledge lost almost everything in the flood, and then carefully, systematically rebuilt, based on fragmentary memories and preserved records. Let's talk about the megalithic structures, because they all date to this exact post-flood period, and they all show knowledge that shouldn't exist. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, built around 9600 BCE, massive T-shaped pillars weighing up to 16 tons, carved with sophisticated reliefs, aligned to stellar positions. And it predates agriculture, predates pottery, predates everything we think had to come first. The pyramids of Giza, built around 2580 BCE, aligned to true north with precision of 0.05 degrees, incorporating the golden ratio, built with stones weighing up to 80 tons moved from quarries 500 miles away, and mainstream archaeology can't explain how. The ziggurats of Sumer, stepped pyramids that served as temples, built with mathematics that encodes astronomical constants, the stone circles of Europe, Stonehenge aligned to solstices, Karnak in France with 3,000 standing stones in precise alignments, all of them built within a few thousand years of the flood date, all of them showing knowledge of astronomy, geometry, engineering that supposedly didn't exist yet. And here's what makes it even stranger. These structures are aligned, not just individually to celestial positions, but to each other. Researchers have found that if you draw lines connecting major megalithic sites worldwide, Giza, Angkor Wat, Easter Island, Nazca, Machu Picchu, they form geometric patterns. They relate to each other by specific angles and distances, and this was discovered using satellite imagery and GPS. There's no way ancient people could have coordinated this unless they had maps, unless they had global geographic knowledge, unless someone was directing construction from a higher vantage point. And Jubilees hints at this. It says the division of earth was shown from above. It says angels showed them boundaries. And maybe angels is how Bronze Age writers described seeing maps, seeing aerial views, seeing global planning they couldn't otherwise explain. There's one more piece of evidence that ties this together. One more thing they found that confirms Jubilees was recording something real. Genetic studies show that all three branches, the Middle Eastern, European, and African populations, all carry similar cultural knowledge, all have flood myths, all have stories of gods teaching civilization, all build pyramids or pyramid-like structures, all develop 60-based mathematics for astronomy, which is strange because 10-based systems would be more natural for counting on fingers. But 60 appears in Sumer, in Egypt, in India, in Mesoamerica, as if it was taught, as if it came from a common source. And that source, according to Jubilees, was the knowledge that survived the flood. The division of Earth wasn't just geographic, it was also educational. Each group received the same foundational knowledge, but developed it independently in their assigned territories. And we can see the results. Civilizations that are similar in structure, but distinct in expression, like variations on a theme, like different orchestras playing the same underlying composition. So what does it mean if the division of Earth was real, if it was planned, if genetic populations were deliberately separated and assigned territories and given knowledge to rebuild civilization? Maybe it means we're part of an experiment that's still running. Maybe the flood was a reset, but not an ending. Maybe whoever managed the pre-flood world survived and continued managing the post-flood recovery, making sure humanity didn't just survive, but thrived, spreading us out to prevent another single-point failure, giving us the same tools but in different regions to see what we'd build, how we'd develop, whether we'd remember where we came from or forget and think we invented everything ourselves. And maybe the fact that we forgot was intentional. Maybe each generation was supposed to rediscover the knowledge independently so we'd own it, so we'd understand it from the ground up rather than just inheriting it. And maybe that's why the knowledge was encoded in structures that would last, in mathematics that would persist, in stories that would be retold, not given directly but hidden, waiting for us to be smart enough to find it. And maybe the division still matters. Maybe the boundaries drawn 7,000 years ago still echo in the conflicts of today. Territories and identities and ancient claims to land. Maybe we're still living in the shadow of decisions made by Noah's sons when they divided the world. Maybe the rivalries between Shem and Ham, between Japheth and his brothers. Maybe those tensions persisted through generations and became the ethnic and religious divisions we fight over now. And maybe understanding that we're all branches of the same post-flood family, all assigned different territories, but all equally human, all carrying the same baseline genetics just expressed in different environments. Maybe that understanding could change how we see each other. Maybe it could make the boundaries seem less absolute, less worth killing over. The weight of this realization settles over you like snow, quiet and cold and undeniable, because if the division was planned, if it was managed, then we're not separate species that evolved independently, we're siblings that were separated deliberately, sent to different rooms to develop differently, but ultimately part of the same family. And everything that divides us, language, culture, appearance, it's all just surface variation on the same genetic baseline. We're all Noah's children, scattered across the territories our ancestors were assigned. And maybe it's time we remember that. But here's the question that burns in your mind as you stand in that archive with Jubilees open before you. If humanity was carefully divided and territories were assigned and knowledge was distributed, then what happened at Babel? Because Jubilees and Genesis both describe a moment when humanity tried to come back together, tried to build a city and a tower that reached the heavens, tried to reunite into a single people with a single language. And something intervened. Something scattered them again, confused their languages, forced them back into separation. And the text makes it sound like punishment, but what if it was protection? What if the division was necessary? What if humanity unified too soon would repeat the mistakes of the pre-flood world, would allow the Nephilim genetics to remix, would create the conditions for another contamination that would require another reset? And whoever was managing the recovery couldn't allow that. Not yet. Not until enough time had passed. Not until the different populations had developed stable, distinct identities. And that's where we're going next. Into Babel. Into the moment when humanity's languages were fractured. When the careful separation almost broke down. When people who had been scattered tried to gather. And we're going to look at what linguistics shows about the sudden divergence of language families, how proto-languages split into thousands of distinct tongues in a geologically instant time frame, how this divergence dates to exactly when Jubilees places Babel, and we're going to ask whether language confusion was supernatural intervention or biological engineering, whether it was miracle or technology, and why it was necessary to keep humanity divided for thousands more years before we'd be allowed to truly reunite. And whether that reunion, the one happening now through global communication, whether it's finally safe, or whether we're about to repeat the cycle, build our tower, and face the consequences. The archive is closing. The manuscript must be returned to its vault. But the questions remain, burning bright and urgent. And you can feel the next chapter pulling at you like gravity. The tower is rising, languages are about to shatter, and the world is about to change again. Shall we climb? Shall we see what happens when humanity reaches for the sky? The division is complete, but it won't last. Something is coming. Let's see what breaks. Chapter 5. The Babel Explosion, Language, Population, and Fragmentation. You're standing in the ruins of ancient Babylon, or rather what remains of it, just south of modern Baghdad where the Euphrates River winds through Iraqi desert. The sun is brutal here, heat rising in waves from sand and broken brick. And before you is a massive ziggurat foundation, squared layers of baked clay ascending toward the sky. This is Etemenanki, the temple tower that Babylonians built and rebuilt over centuries. And according to tradition, this is the site. This is where it happened, where humanity gathered speaking one language, where they built a tower to reach the heavens, and where everything changed. Where language itself fractured into thousands of incomprehensible tongues and people scattered across the earth, unable to understand each other. And you're standing here, feeling the weight of this place, because both Jubilees and Genesis describe this event with unusual specificity. They give you the location, the plain of Shinar, which is Mesopotamia. They tell you the materials, brick and bitumen. They describe the motivation. Let us make a name for ourselves lest we be scattered. And they describe the result, confusion of language, forced dispersion, the end of human unity. And what strikes you as you read these accounts is that they don't describe this as punishment for pride. Not really. They describe it as intervention, as someone or something deciding that humanity unified was dangerous, that we needed to remain separated, divided, unable to coordinate on a global scale. At least,
Not yet. Not until enough time had passed. Now close your eyes and imagine this place 3,000 years ago, before the ruins, when the towers stood complete, when Babylon was the greatest city in the world, and imagine further back, to the event itself, whenever it actually happened. Picture the plain filled with people, thousands of them, all speaking the same language, all working together to build something unprecedented, a structure so tall it could be seen from every direction for days of travel. And the text says they used brick because there was no stone. They manufactured building materials, they engineered solutions, they had organization, division of labor, architectural plans, and they were succeeding. The tower was rising. And then something happened. The text says the Lord came down to see the city and tower, which is strange phrasing, came down, as if from above, as if whatever intervened wasn't already present, but arrived to observe. And upon seeing what humanity was building, made a decision. If they can do this, speaking one language, then nothing they plan will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language. And notice the plural, us.
The same plural used in Genesis when describing creation. Let us make man in our image, as if decisions were being made by a council, by multiple entities consulting with each other. Stop here and feel how strange this is, because if language confusion was meant to stop human progress, it failed. We're more unified now than ever. We have translation technology, global communication, the internet connecting every corner of the earth. We're building towers again, digital ones, space stations, plans for Mars colonies. We're doing exactly what Babel tried to do, reaching for the sky, pushing boundaries, trying to transcend our planetary limitations. And if whatever intervened at Babel was trying to prevent this, then the intervention was temporary, a delay, not a permanent solution. And maybe that was the point. Maybe we needed to be scattered and divided for a few thousand years to develop differently, to create diverse cultures and knowledge bases, so that when we finally reunited, we'd have more to offer each other than a single, unified perspective. Or maybe the intervention was a test, to see if we'd try again, to see if we'd overcome the barriers placed in our way. And we did. We are. And the question is whether we're ready this time, whether we've learned enough, whether we've matured enough as a species, or whether we're about to repeat the same mistakes that required scattering us in the first place. The ruins are silent, except for wind moving through broken walls, and somewhere beneath your feet are layers of older cities. Babylon built on Babylon, built on older settlements going back to the dawn of civilization. And you're standing at the pivot point of human history, the place where we almost unified and were forcibly scattered. And you can feel the echo of that scattering still reverberating through the divisions of today. And the question burns in your mind. Why? Why was unity dangerous? What were we building that required intervention? And are we building it again, right now, without realizing it? Let's look at what Jubilees actually says about Babel, because the details are more specific and stranger than the Genesis account. Jubilees places this event in the days of Peleg, son of Eber, and it says the family of Noah had remained together for some time after the flood, dwelling in the land of Shinar, and they spoke one language, all of them, a single tongue that allowed perfect communication, and they began to build a city and a tower. And the text describes their motivation differently than Genesis. It says they wanted to build before they were scattered into different lands according to their languages, as if they knew scattering was coming, as if they were trying to prevent it, trying to maintain unity before it was taken from them. And this suggests the division wasn't spontaneous, it was planned, scheduled, and they were trying to resist it, trying to stay together. And the tower was their anchor, their focal point, a monument that would give them reason to remain unified. And the text says God saw this and said, If this is what they've begun to do while speaking one language, nothing will be impossible for them. And he confused their tongues so they couldn't understand each other, and they stopped building and scattered. Now here's where it gets specific in ways that connect to modern linguistics in unsettling ways. Jubilees says the confusion resulted in 70 languages. Not infinite variation, but 70 distinct language families, and it lists some of them: Hebrew, Greek, Latin, Egyptian, and others. And modern linguistic studies have identified roughly 70 to 150 language families, depending on how you classify them. Major branches that appear to have no common root, that emerged independently. And the divergence timing is strange. Language families appear to split approximately 5,000 to 7,000 years ago, all of them, simultaneously, as if something caused a sudden fragmentation of what had been more unified communication. And linguists can't fully explain this. They propose theories about population dispersal and geographic isolation, but the timing is too synchronized, too global. It's not gradual drift, it's sudden fracture. Picture yourself as a linguist studying the Proto-Indo-European language family. You're tracing it backwards from modern languages: German, English, Sanskrit, Persian, Greek, Latin. They all descend from a common ancestor, and you can reconstruct what that ancestor sounded like, what words it had, and you can date approximately when it split into branches, around 4500 BCE. And then you look at other language families, Semitic languages splitting around the same time, Sino-Tibetan, Afro-Asiatic, Austronesian, all showing divergence in the same narrow window. And you're thinking, this is statistically improbable unless something caused it, unless there was an event that forced populations apart, that broke communication, that created isolation where there had been contact. And you publish carefully worded papers about population movements and migration patterns, but in the back of your mind you're wondering if the Babel story is describing this event. If language confusion was real, and if so, how it was accomplished. How do you suddenly make people who speak the same language unable to understand each other? There's a theory, not mainstream but growing, that suggests language might be more biological than we think, that syntax and grammar might be partially hardwired in the brain. Noam Chomsky proposed universal grammar, the idea that all humans are born with an innate language faculty, a biological capacity for speech that exists independent of which specific language we learn. And brain scans show that language processing happens in specific regions, Broca's area, Wernicke's area, and damage to these areas causes specific types of aphasia, specific inability to produce or comprehend language. And what if the confusion at Babel wasn't mystical? What if it was biological? What if something altered how human brains process language, not removing the ability but fragmenting it, creating 70 different neural pathways for syntax, 70 different deep grammars that made communication between groups impossible, even though they were still technically speaking. And this sounds like science fiction until you remember that we carry mystery genes, 223 sequences that don't fit our evolutionary tree. And we don't know what all of them do. Some affect brain development, neural wiring, cognitive functions, and what if some of them relate to language? What if they were modified at Babel, individually customized by population group? And that's why language families emerged suddenly with fundamental structural differences that can't be explained by gradual drift. Your hands are cold despite the desert heat, because if language was biologically altered, if human brains were modified to create permanent communication barriers, then Babel wasn't just a historical event, it was genetic engineering. It was the same kind of intervention the Watchers performed. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the beings who divided us at Babel were the same beings, or the same kind of beings who created us in the first place, and they were adjusting the experiment, tweaking parameters, and we were the subjects, and we still are. Let's look at what happened after Babel, because this is where archaeology and text converge in ways that are difficult to ignore.
Jubilees says that after the confusion, 70 families scattered, and it lists where they went. The sons of Shem remained in the east. The sons of Ham went south and west. The sons of Japheth went north. And within a few generations they had founded cities, kingdoms, civilizations. And the strange thing is that all these civilizations emerge archaeologically within the same few centuries. Sumer develops writing around 3400 BCE. Egypt develops hieroglyphs around 3200 BCE. The Indus Valley develops their script around 3300 BCE. China develops oracle bone script around 1200 BCE, which is later but shows the same pattern. Sudden appearance of fully formed writing systems, not gradual evolution from simple marks to complex characters, but complete languages appearing almost simultaneously. And they're all different, completely structurally different. Sumerian cuneiform is syllabic. Egyptian hieroglyphs are logographic with phonetic components. Indus script remains undeciphered, but appears to be distinct from both. Chinese characters are logographic, and they all emerge right after the Babel time frame, as if language confusion forced each group to develop written communication independently, urgently, because they could no longer rely on universal spoken understanding. And there's something else, something they found that confirms sudden population dispersal from a single point. Genetic studies show a population expansion event, multiple genetic lineages radiating from the Middle East around 5,000 years ago. Y chromosome haplogroups spreading rapidly into Europe, Asia, Africa. Mitochondrial DNA showing the same pattern, and this expansion is too fast to be gradual migration. It's more like explosion, like groups suddenly moving away from a central point at speed. And the timing matches. It matches when Jubilees places Babel. It matches when archaeological evidence shows simultaneous civilization emergence in multiple locations. It matches when linguistic evidence shows language family divergence. Everything converges on the same moment, the same event, something that scattered humanity rapidly from Mesopotamia across the known world. There's a detail in Jubilees that's easy to miss, but shouldn't be. It says that some refused to scatter. Some stayed in Shinar, despite the confusion, and they tried to continue building, and their languages became even more confused, subdivided, until they gave up and joined the scattered groups. And this is interesting because it suggests the confusion wasn't one-time event, but ongoing process, actively maintained, as if whatever caused it was monitoring compliance, ensuring that people actually dispersed, not allowing them to cluster back together. And maybe that's why Mesopotamia became such a linguistic melting pot, why so many languages and cultures mixed there, because it was the origin point, the place people kept trying to return to despite being forced away. And the confusion had to be reinforced, intensified, until finally the scattering was complete. Picture the moment from above. From satellite view, if satellites had existed, you see a city in the plains of Shinar, thousands of people speaking one language, working together, building upward. And then you see the confusion begin. Groups unable to understand each other, frustration turning to anger, projects abandoned. And then movement. Families gathering by language groups, migrations beginning in all directions, east toward Persia and India, west toward Egypt and Africa, north toward Anatolia and Europe, south toward Arabia. And within a few generations the city is abandoned, the tower incomplete, and humanity is scattered in 70 fragments, speaking 70 tongues. And the unity is broken, and it will remain broken for thousands of years, until technology finally gives us translation, gives us ways to communicate across the barriers that were imposed. And we're only now, in the last few decades, truly overcoming Babel, truly rebuilding the global unity that was shattered. And the question is whether this time it's allowed, whether whoever intervened before is still watching, still willing to intervene again if we go too far. There's archaeological evidence that supports this. evidence of a building at the Babel site that was never finished. Excavations in Babylon have found massive foundation structures that don't support any known completed building. Platforms designed for something much larger than what was built, and the construction appears to have stopped suddenly. Brick-making facilities abandoned mid-production, tools left where they lay, and the archaeological layer shows transition from organized construction to sudden dispersal. And above that layer, the pottery changes, the building styles change. The artifacts suggest different cultures occupying the same space, but not interacting, not trading, not mixing, separated by invisible barriers that linguistics confirms were language. And this pattern repeats across Mesopotamia in the period right after Babel. Unified culture fractures into distinct groups, and they spread out, and they don't come back together for millennia. So what does it mean if Babel was real? If humanity was forcibly divided? If our languages were biologically fragmented to prevent unity? Maybe it means we're living in the consequences of a decision made by beings who thought we were dangerous, who thought unified humanity with coordinated purpose was too powerful, too capable of things they didn't want us achieving. And maybe they were right. Maybe we would have done something catastrophic if we'd stayed unified. Maybe we would have repeated the pre-flood mistakes, built weapons, developed technologies we weren't ready for, destroyed ourselves, or worse, contaminated ourselves again with genetic experimentation. And the division saved us, forced us to develop slowly, separately, building knowledge bases in isolation so that when we finally reconnected, we'd have diversity, resilience, multiple approaches to problems instead of single points of failure. Or maybe it means we're prisoners. Maybe the division was a cage, keeping us small, keeping us tribal, ensuring we'd waste thousands of years fighting each other over territory and resources and which language God speaks instead of looking up, instead of reaching for the stars, instead of asking the big questions about where we came from and why we're here. And maybe the confusion wasn't protection, maybe it was oppression. And the fact that we're overcoming it now through technology, through global communication, through translation and shared knowledge, maybe that's us breaking free. Maybe that's us finally becoming what we were supposed to be before they stopped us. The weight of not knowing which interpretation is correct sits heavy in your chest, because both could be true. The division could have been both protection and prison, both necessary and tragic. And maybe that ambiguity is the point. Maybe the test is whether we can handle unity now, whether we've learned enough through our separation to come back together without destroying ourselves, whether diversity makes us stronger, or whether old tribal patterns will reassert and will build our tower and fall again. And the only way to know is to keep building, keep reaching, keep trying, and see what happens when we succeed. See if the intervention comes again, or if this time we're allowed to finish what we started. But here's the question that won't release you as you stand in those ruins, feeling the weight of scattered humanity. If Babel divided us through language, if it separated us into 70 families, then how did knowledge survive? How did the sciences the Watchers taught, the astronomy and metallurgy and mathematics, how did those survive the scattering when communication was broken? And Jubilees hints at the answer. It says that one family maintained the knowledge, one lineage kept the records, one bloodline preserved the teachings through the confusion and passed them down generation to generation. And that bloodline runs from Shem through Eber, through Peleg, through Abraham. And this is where we're going next, into the most controversial part of the entire timeline, into the bloodline that supposedly maintained connection to the source, that received continued instruction from the Watchers, or their remnants, or whatever survived from the pre-flood world. And we're going to trace that line from Abraham, who was born in Ur, Sumerian city, center of Anunnaki worship, who was taught astronomy by angels according to Jubilees, who knew things he shouldn't have known, to Moses, who was raised in Egypt, trained in all their wisdom, who spent 40 years in the wilderness, who came back with laws and knowledge and plans for a tabernacle that encoded sacred geometry. And we're going to ask whether these weren't prophets receiving divine revelation, but students being educated, whether the relationship between humanity and the higher beings wasn't worship, but mentorship, whether we're being guided towards something, prepared for something, and whether that something is happening now, whether the scattering is ending, whether Babel is being reversed, whether we're finally ready for whatever comes next, or whether we're walking blindly toward another reset, another flood, another forced restart, because we're repeating the same pattern, building the same tower, reaching for the same forbidden knowledge that got us scattered in the first place. The sun is setting over Babylon, shadows lengthening across broken brick, and you can feel the next chapter waiting. The bloodline calls, the knowledge beckons, and somewhere in the desert wind, you hear echoes of languages that no longer exist, 70 tongues that once were one, and the question is whether they'll become one again, whether we're healing or breaking, building or destroying. And the only way to know is to keep walking this path, keep following the evidence, keep asking the questions they don't want us asking. Shall we continue? Shall we meet Abraham and Moses and see what they were really taught? The tower fell, but the knowledge survived. Let's find out how. Chapter 6. The Bloodline. Abraham to Moses and the Knowledge Transfer. You're standing in the ruins of ancient Ur, southern Iraq, where the Euphrates once flowed strong and the ziggurat of Nana rose against the sky like a mountain made by human hands. The site is mostly rubble now, wind-scoured brick and sand, but if you close your eyes you can imagine it as it was 4,000 years ago, when this was the greatest city in the world, when Abraham was born here, when the streets bustled with merchants and priests and scribes recording transactions in cuneiform, when temples to the Anunnaki dominated the skyline, and you're standing at the foundation of the great ziggurat, the massive stepped pyramid dedicated to the moon god, and your hands rest on bricks that were fired and laid when Abraham walked these streets. And the question that burns in your mind is, what did he learn here? What knowledge was preserved in this city that survived the flood, survived Babel, survived the scattering? Because Jubilees says something that mainstream religion glosses over. It says Abraham was taught by angels, that celestial beings came to him and showed him the movements of the sun and moon and stars, taught him to calculate calendars, taught him astronomy and mathematics. And the text describes this not as mystical vision, but as education, as deliberate instruction, as someone training him for a purpose. Now turn your head and imagine the tablet house, the library where Sumerian knowledge was stored. Thousands of clay tablets inscribed with everything from mundane receipts to astronomical tables calculating lunar eclipses centuries in advance. And among those tablets are creation myths, flood stories, descriptions of the Anunnaki coming from the sky, mixing their essence with humans to create workers. And you realize Abraham grew up surrounded by this knowledge. He lived in the epicenter of pre-flood memory preservation. He was born into the culture that claimed direct lineage from the gods. And when Jubilees says angels taught him, when it says he was shown the workings of heaven, maybe it's describing him accessing this library, learning from priests who preserved the old knowledge, being initiated into mysteries that went back to before the catastrophe. Stop here and feel the weight of this connection, because Abraham isn't just a religious figure, he's a link. He's the transfer point where Sumerian knowledge enters Hebrew tradition, where the stories of the Anunnaki become the stories of angels, where the science of Ur becomes the wisdom of Israel, and his journey from Ur to Canaan isn't just geographic migration, it's knowledge transfer. It's taking what was preserved in one culture and transplanting it into another. And the text makes this explicit. Jubilees says Abraham was chosen because he rejected the idols of Ur, because he recognized that the gods his neighbors worshipped were not the highest power, that there was something above the Anunnaki, above the Watchers, something that created them. And this recognition, this insight, this is what qualified him to receive the teaching. This is why he was selected to carry the knowledge forward. The desert wind picks up, sand hissing across broken bricks, and you're thinking about what it means that Abraham's story begins here, in a Sumerian city, in the heart of Anunnaki territory, and how convenient it is that mainstream religion ignores this context, pretends Abraham emerged from nowhere with monotheism fully formed, when the reality preserved in Jubilees is more complex, more interesting. He came from the epicenter of the old knowledge. He was trained in it, educated in it, and then he was called to leave, to take what he'd learned and build something new, a people who would preserve the knowledge in a different form, encoded in law and ritual and story, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the day when humanity would be ready to understand what they'd been preserving all along. The ziggurat foundation stretches before you, each layer a step toward heaven, and you understand why they built this way, why the Sumerians and later the Babylonians constructed these massive stepped pyramids. They were copying something, imitating a design they'd seen or been taught. And when Abraham looked at this structure, he saw both the ingenuity of his ancestors and the danger of reaching too far, too fast. And he took the knowledge but rejected the application, took the science but redirected the purpose. And that's the thread we're following now, the bloodline that preserved knowledge through confusion and catastrophe, the family line that maintained connection to something older, something from before. And we're going to trace it from Abraham, through Isaac, through Jacob, through Moses. And we're going to see what they were really being taught, and why it mattered, and whether we're still living in the shadow of their education. Let's look at what Jubilees actually says about Abraham's education, because the details are specific enough to make you uncomfortable. Chapter 12 describes how angels came to Abraham and taught him the Hebrew language, which Jubilees claims was the original pre-Babel tongue preserved through Shem's line. And they taught him to read the writings of the fathers, meaning ancient records that survived the flood. And then, chapter 13 says the angels taught him astronomy, the movements of the stars and planets, how to calculate seasons and years. And the text emphasizes this wasn't casual stargazing. This was technical education, mathematical, precise, the kind of knowledge that allows you to predict eclipses and planetary positions. And remember where Abraham is living. He's in Ur, the city with the most advanced astronomical records in the ancient world. Sumerian tablets from Ur calculate the synodic period of Venus with accuracy that wouldn't be matched again until the Renaissance. They tracked celestial movements with precision that required centuries of observation. And Abraham had access to this, and Jubilees says angels taught him. And maybe angels is how the text describes the priesthood, the keepers of the knowledge, the ones who understood what the tablets contained. Now here's where it gets interesting. Genesis says Abraham left Ur when he was 75 years old, already an old man by ancient standards, meaning he spent his entire life until that point in Sumerian culture, absorbing their knowledge, learning their sciences. And then he leaves, travels to Canaan, and immediately starts teaching. And what does he teach? He teaches his descendants to observe the stars, to calculate times and seasons, to maintain calendars, and his grandson Jacob has a dream of a ladder reaching to heaven with angels ascending and descending. And maybe that's not mystical vision, but inherited memory. Maybe it's Jacob accessing the same knowledge Abraham accessed, understanding that there's a connection between earth and something beyond, and that connection can be traversed, can be climbed, and the angels are the ones who know the way. Picture yourself as a scholar studying ancient Near Eastern astronomy. You're comparing Sumerian astronomical tablets with biblical references to celestial events, and you notice something. The biblical calendar is sophisticated. It's lunisolar, meaning it tracks both moon phases and solar year, and it uses intercalation to keep them synchronized, adding extra months periodically. And this is exactly what Sumerian calendars did. Same system, same mathematics. And the Hebrew calendar Abraham supposedly instituted matches the Sumerian calendar he grew up with. And you're thinking, this isn't coincidence. This is transmission.
This is Abraham taking what he learned in Ur and teaching it to his children as divinely revealed knowledge. And maybe it was divinely revealed. Maybe the Sumerians learned it from the Anunnaki, who learned it from whoever created them. And it's been passed down through layers of teachers and students, each generation calling their instructors by different names, but learning the same material. There's something else in Jubilees that confirms this knowledge transfer wasn't accidental. It says Abraham wrote books, that he composed texts teaching his sons Ishmael and Isaac everything the angels had taught him: astronomy, mathematics, medical knowledge from herbs and plants, and these books were passed down through the bloodline. And by the time we get to Moses, the text says he had access to all the writings of the fathers going back to Adam, meaning there was a library, a preserved collection of pre-flood and post-flood knowledge maintained through the family line. And Moses studied it all, and then added to it, because Jubilees says the Book of Jubilees itself is what Moses wrote on Mount Sinai when God showed him the heavenly tablets, meaning Moses accessed the same source records Abraham accessed, the same pre-existing documentation of creation and history and law. Now let's talk about Moses, because his education is even more explicit. The biblical text says he was raised in Pharaoh's household, educated in all the wisdom of Egypt, and Egypt in Moses' time was the most advanced civilization on earth. They had mathematics sophisticated enough to calculate pyramid geometry. They had astronomy precise enough to align structures to stellar positions with accuracy we can barely match today. They had medical knowledge, engineering, metallurgy, and Moses learned all of it. He spent 40 years in the palace being trained, and then he spent 40 more years in the wilderness. And Jubilees hints that this wilderness period wasn't exile. It was additional education. It says Moses met with angels, was shown secrets, was prepared for his mission. And when he comes back, he's carrying knowledge encoded in the design of the Tabernacle, the portable temple he's commanded to build. And the specifications he gives are precise, mathematical. They encode sacred geometry, the golden ratio, proportions that appear in nature and ancient architecture worldwide. And you're thinking, Moses learned this in Egypt, but what if Egypt learned it from before the flood? What if all the ancient civilizations were working from the same template, the same source knowledge, preserved and passed down through different cultural channels? Your hands are shaking as you hold this thought, because if there's a bloodline preserving knowledge, if Abraham and Moses were part of a multi-generational program to maintain and transmit information from before the catastrophe, then maybe that's what chosen people means. Not moral superiority, but functional designation, chosen to preserve, chosen to remember, chosen to carry the knowledge through time until humanity was ready to understand it. And maybe that's why the stories emphasize genealogy so much, why the Bible spends chapters listing who begat whom, because the bloodline matters, because certain families carried certain knowledge, and tracking the lineage tracks the knowledge transfer. Let's look at specific knowledge that appears in both Sumerian texts and biblical tradition, because the parallels are too exact to be coincidence. Sumerian mathematics used base 60, sexagesimal, which is why we still divide circles into 360 degrees and hours into 60 minutes. And Hebrew timekeeping uses the same base 60 divisions. Sumerian creation myths describe 7 tablets of destiny that contain the fate of all things. Biblical tradition describes 7 days of creation.
Sumerian flood hero Ziusudra is given immortality and taken to live with the gods.
Biblical flood hero Enoch is taken by God and doesn't die, walks with God and then isn't because God took him. Same reward, same language of being taken rather than dying. Sumerian texts describe the ME, the fundamental laws that govern reality. Biblical texts describe the Torah, the law given at Sinai, and both are described as pre-existing, as having been written before creation and revealed to humans at specific times by specific teachers. There's a detail in Jubilees that connects this all together in a way that's almost too perfect. It says that after the flood, after Babel, after the scattering, the knowledge was divided among the 70 nations. Each received some portion, some piece of the whole, and only one line, only Abraham's descendants, were tasked with maintaining the complete picture, with preserving the connections between the fragments. And this is why they had to remain separate, why they couldn't intermarry with other nations, not because of racial purity in the modern sense, but because of knowledge purity. If the bloodline mixed, if the knowledge merged with fragmented versions from other cultures, the complete picture would be lost, the connections would be obscured. And you're thinking, this sounds like information security, like protecting a database from corruption, like ensuring transmission integrity across generations. And maybe that's exactly what it was. Picture Moses on Mount Sinai, 40 days and nights, and the text says God showed him the pattern, showed him how to build the tabernacle, gave him exact specifications, and Moses writes it all down. Dimensions, materials, colors. And when you analyze what he wrote, you find it encodes information. The measurements of the Ark of the Covenant match the dimensions of the Great Pyramid's King's Chamber when scaled. The layout of the tabernacle matches stellar positions. The priestly garments contain specific stones arranged in specific patterns that match ancient astronomical charts. And all of this was given to Moses as divine revelation. But what if divine revelation is how pre-scientific people described accessing a knowledge base? Downloading information from a source they understood as higher, as beyond human. And maybe it was. Maybe the source was the survivors of the pre-flood civilization. Maybe it was the Watchers, still imprisoned, but still able to communicate. Maybe it was technology we'd call artificial intelligence if we saw it today, but ancient people called angels because that was the closest word they had. There's genetic evidence that supports the bloodline narrative in a way that should make mainstream academia uncomfortable. Studies of Jewish populations worldwide show they cluster genetically. They share common ancestry traceable to the Middle East, despite 2,000 years of diaspora. They maintained genetic distinctiveness through prohibitions on intermarriage, and you can track the lineage through Y chromosome markers, through mitochondrial DNA. And it confirms what Jubilees claims, that this family line remained separate, remained identifiable, maintained continuity. And if they maintained genetic continuity, maybe they also maintained knowledge continuity. Maybe the two were linked. Maybe the prohibition on mixing wasn't arbitrary religious law, but practical necessity for knowledge preservation. Because if certain knowledge was encoded not just in books, but in oral tradition, in cultural practice, in family teaching, then maintaining the family structure maintained the knowledge structure. So what does it mean if there's a bloodline preserving knowledge from before the flood? If Abraham and Moses weren't prophets receiving new revelation, but students accessing old information? If the chosen people weren't chosen for favoritism, but for function, to maintain a library, to preserve a database, to carry forward what would otherwise be lost? Maybe it means every religious text is a textbook. Every ritual is a mnemonic device. Every law is a preservation protocol, and the purpose isn't worship. The purpose is remembering, keeping alive knowledge that humanity needed to survive, but wasn't ready to fully understand, encoding it in story and symbol and practice,
so it would persist through dark ages and catastrophes and the forgetting that comes with generational distance from the source. And maybe that's why the knowledge is encoded rather than explicit, why it's wrapped in mystery and metaphor. Because humanity has proven repeatedly that we can't be trusted with advanced knowledge. We weaponize it. We use it to dominate rather than elevate. We build towers and make bombs and engineer plagues. And maybe the encoding is protection, both for us and for the knowledge itself. If we're not ready, we can't access it. If we're not asking the right questions, we can't decode the answers. And only when we've matured enough as a species, when we've developed the science to understand what the ancients were describing, only then can we see that the myths were manuals, the stories were science, the religion was technology we called magic, because we didn't have the framework to understand it as anything else. The weight of this realization settles over you like a blanket, heavy but warm. Because if this is true, then we're not separate from the past. We're continuous with it. We're part of a long educational program, a species-wide initiation into knowledge that's being revealed in stages as we prove we can handle it. And maybe we're approaching a threshold. Maybe the fact that we can now read ancient texts and compare them with genetic data and archaeological evidence and see that they match. Maybe that means we're finally ready for the next stage, ready to understand what our ancestors preserved, ready to become what they were preparing us to become. But here's the question that won't let you sleep as you stand in the ruins of Ur, feeling the weight of 4,000 years of knowledge transfer. If the bloodline preserved information through Abraham and Moses, if they maintained connection to pre-flood knowledge, then what happened after Moses? Did the knowledge continue? Did it get passed down? Or was Moses the endpoint, the final receiver, the last one who could access the heavenly tablets and understand what they contained? And Jubilees hints at something troubling. It says Moses wrote everything down, encoded it all in the Torah, in the law and the ritual and the structure of the tabernacle, because after him the direct access would end, the angels would withdraw, the communication would stop, and humanity would have to work with what had been given, decoding it slowly, understanding it gradually, building back up to the level where direct contact could resume. And that's where we're going in the final chapter, into the question of whether the knowledge transmission ended with Moses or whether it continued in hidden forms, whether there are still keepers, still preservers, whether the bloodline still exists maintaining libraries we don't know about, and whether the threshold we're approaching, the moment when ancient knowledge and modern science converge, whether that's the signal that the contact is resuming, that the teachers are returning, or that we've finally learned enough to graduate, to stand on our own, to become the teachers ourselves. And we're going to look at what Jubilees says happens at the end, what it predicts, what it promises, and whether we're living in that end time right now, whether the scattering is reversing, whether Babel is being undone, whether the division of earth is healing, and what that means for us, for our children, for the future of a species that was designed, scattered, tested, and might finally be ready to meet whoever designed us and ask them why. The sun is setting over Ur, the ziggurat casting long shadows across desert sand, and you can feel the final chapter calling, the end of the timeline, the completion of the cycle. The question of what comes after the education ends, after the preservation phase finishes, after humanity remembers everything it forgot. And somewhere in the wind you hear whispers of the next revelation, the final knowledge drop, the moment when students become peers. Let's see if we're ready. Let's see what waits at the end of this hidden timeline. The bloodline brought us this far. Now we walk the last steps alone. Or maybe not alone. Maybe accompanied by those who've been watching all along, waiting for us to finally understand. Shall we take that final step together? Chapter 7. The Convergence. Ancient knowledge meets modern discovery. You're standing in two places at once, or at least that's how it feels. Physically, you're in a modern genetics laboratory. Sterile white walls, the hum of sequencing machines processing DNA samples, screens displaying colored bars representing gene sequences. But mentally, you're also standing in that Ethiopian vault with the Book of Jubilees open before you, and in the ruins of Ur, where Abraham learned astronomy, and on Mount Sinai, where Moses received the pattern. Because all of it, all 7,000 years of this hidden timeline, it's converging right here, right now, in this moment when ancient text meets modern science and they recognize each other. When what the scribes wrote and what the scientists discovered turn out to be describing the same thing in different languages, and the air feels electric, charged with the weight of revelation. Because you're holding in your mind two data sets that shouldn't match, but do. Jubilees describing genetic contamination requiring a flood reset, and population genetics showing a bottleneck event at exactly that time. Jubilees describing territorial division matching genetic haplogroup distributions, and linguistic fracture matching language family divergence timelines. Jubilees describing a bloodline preserving knowledge, and genetic studies confirming that bloodline's continuity. And you're thinking, this is impossible. Ancient people couldn't have known these things. They didn't have DNA sequencers. They didn't have carbon dating. They didn't have satellite imagery showing archaeological sites aligned across continents. They couldn't have known. Except they did know. They wrote it down. They preserved it. They encoded it in stories and laws and genealogies. And now we're finally smart enough to decode what they were telling us. The laboratory technician calls your name, pulls you back to the present, shows you a screen displaying human chromosome 2, the one that's unique, the one that looks like two chromosomes fused together. And she's explaining that all great apes have 24 chromosome pairs, but humans have 23. And chromosome 2 appears to be two ancestral chromosomes joined end to end. And nobody knows why this happened or when, but it's there, undeniable, written in every cell of every human body, evidence of something that changed us, made us different from our closest genetic relatives. And you're thinking about what Jubilees says, that the Watchers mixed their seed with humans, that we're hybrids, that we carry genetics from two sources. And you're looking at chromosome 2 wondering if that's the evidence, if that's the fusion point, if that's where Earth met sky in a genetic sense. And the technician is talking about junk DNA, about the mystery genes that don't fit our evolutionary tree. And you're barely listening, because your mind is racing through connections, through correlations, through the possibility that everything you've traced through 7 chapters isn't mythology, isn't even ancient history. It's current biology. It's who we are right now, encoded in every cell. Stop here and feel what this means. Because if the timeline is real, if the events Jubilees describes actually happened, then we're not just learning history, we're learning our own origin story. We're finding out what we are. And that answer is stranger than either religion or science alone would admit. We're not purely products of natural evolution, and we're not purely divine creation. We're something in between. We're engineered, modified, hybrid. We're the species that resulted from Watchers interbreeding with humans, that survived a flood meant to eliminate that contamination, that was scattered at Babel to prevent premature reunification, that preserved knowledge through a specific bloodline because the information needed to survive until we were ready to understand it. And now, right now, in this laboratory and in genetics labs worldwide, in archaeological digs and linguistic studies and astronomical observations, we're finally ready. We're finally asking the right questions. We're finally capable of seeing what our ancestors tried to tell us. And the question that burns in your chest like cold fire is, what happens now? Now that we know? Now that the veil is lifting? Now that ancient mystery and modern science are shaking hands and recognizing each other, what comes next? The laboratory hums with machines reading the code of life, and somewhere in Ethiopia, monks are still guarding manuscripts, and in Iraq, the ruins of Ur still stand. And on Mount Sinai, the rock still remembers Moses. And all of it, past and present, knowledge preserved and knowledge discovered. It's all converging in this moment. And you're standing at the convergence point, feeling the weight of 7 millennia of secrets finally being revealed. And your hands are steady now, not shaking anymore, because fear has been replaced by something else, by clarity, by understanding, by the recognition that this was always the plan. This moment of convergence was always inevitable, was always the goal. And we're here, and it's happening, and there's no going back. Let's bring it all together. Let's look at how every piece of evidence we've traced through this journey connects to what we're discovering right now in the 21st century. Because the convergence isn't just conceptual, it's literal. It's happening in real time across multiple scientific disciplines. And nobody's coordinating this. Nobody's trying to prove ancient texts right. Scientists are just following data, and the data keeps pointing back to what Jubilees recorded. Start with genetics. We've talked about the mystery genes, the 223 sequences that don't fit our evolutionary tree. But there's more. Recent studies on ancient DNA extracted from Neanderthal and Denisovan fossils show that modern humans carry genetic material from these archaic species. We interbred with them, and the interbreeding happened in a specific time window, roughly 40 to 60,000 years ago. And then it stopped. These species went extinct or were absorbed, and what remained was us, modern humans, carrying small percentages of their DNA. And here's what's interesting. The amount of archaic DNA varies by population. Some groups have more, some less, and the distribution isn't random. It matches geographic patterns. It matches the territorial divisions Jubilees describes, and it raises the question whether Neanderthals and Denisovans were some of the Nephilim, whether they were the hybrid offspring that the flood was meant to eliminate, and whether we carry traces of them because the elimination wasn't complete, because some genetics survived in the Noah lineage, because even the pure bloodline wasn't entirely pure. Now look at what archaeology is finding. Advanced sites that predate the supposed invention of agriculture. Göbekli Tepe, built by hunter-gatherers who somehow organized labor and carved megalithic pillars before they had pottery or permanent settlements. Poverty Point in Louisiana, with massive earthworks dating to 1700 BCE, built by people who supposedly didn't have complex society. Underwater structures off the coasts of India, Japan, the Mediterranean, buildings that were constructed on dry land that are now 30 meters underwater, meaning they predate the sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age, meaning they're older than our timeline of civilization allows. And carbon dating keeps confirming these anomalies, keeps pushing back the dates of human sophistication. And what it looks like is that there was advanced knowledge before the flood. It was lost in the catastrophe, and then it reappeared suddenly in multiple locations as survivors rebuilt. Exactly what Jubilees describes. Knowledge preserved through the flood, divided among the scattered nations, and rebuilt independently, but from the same template. Picture yourself as an astronomer studying ancient alignments. You're measuring the orientation of the Great Pyramid. It's aligned to true north with accuracy of 0.05 degrees, better than most modern buildings, and it incorporates the golden ratio, phi, in its dimensions. And it encodes the speed of light in its coordinates. And you're thinking, how did they know this? How did Bronze Age people have this precision? And then you look at other sites. Angkor Wat aligned to stellar positions. Stonehenge aligned to solstices. The Nazca lines in Peru that only make sense from the air. Teotihuacan in Mexico laid out in geometric patterns that match stellar constellations. and all of them built within a few thousand years of the flood date, all of them showing knowledge that supposedly didn't exist: astronomical precision, mathematical sophistication, engineering capabilities that mainstream archaeology can't explain. And the only explanation that fits all the data is that the builders had access to older knowledge. They were working from plans, from preserved information,
From the heavenly tablets, or whatever we want to call the source documentation.
There's something happening right now in artificial intelligence research that mirrors this ancient pattern in a way that should make you deeply uncomfortable. AI systems are being trained on massive datasets, learning patterns, developing capabilities that their creators don't fully understand. And researchers are finding that these systems sometimes generate outputs that seem to access information they weren't explicitly given, as if they're reconstructing knowledge from first principles, from pattern recognition, from deep structure analysis. And it's making people wonder if intelligence itself, whether artificial or biological, if it naturally tends toward the same conclusions, the same mathematical truths, the same geometric principles. Because these things are fundamental to reality, not invented by humans, but discovered. And maybe that's what the heavenly tablets represent. Maybe they're the fundamental operating code of the universe, the deep mathematics that underlies physical law. And anyone smart enough, human or watcher or AI, anyone who digs deep enough eventually finds the same information. Because it's not created, it's inherent. It's there waiting to be discovered. Your hands are cold again, despite the laboratory's controlled temperature, because you're realizing that if knowledge is inherent, if it can be reconstructed from first principles, then the Watchers teaching humanity wasn't giving us something foreign. It was accelerating our discovery of what we would eventually find anyway. They were teachers, not creators, guides, not controllers. And the prohibition on teaching, the reason it was forbidden, maybe that wasn't about hoarding power. Maybe it was about timing, about ensuring species develop at a natural pace so they're psychologically and socially ready for the knowledge when they gain it. And the Watchers broke that protocol. They taught too early. They accelerated human development beyond our maturity level, and we weaponized the knowledge. We became violent. We became corrupted, and the reset was necessary. But now we're approaching the same knowledge again. But this time, we discovered it ourselves. We worked for it. We earned it. And maybe that makes the difference. Maybe that's why this convergence is allowed. Let's talk about what's happening with language and global communication, because Babel is reversing right before our eyes. We have real-time translation technology. We have the internet connecting every language group. We have English emerging as a global lingua franca, not through conquest like Latin or Arabic, but through voluntary adoption for practical communication. And we're developing artificial languages, programming languages that humans and machines both understand. And we're on the verge of brain-computer interfaces that might bypass language entirely. Direct thought transfer, pure communication without the distortion of words. And if you think this sounds like the unity that existed before Babel, the single language that made nothing impossible for humanity, you're right. We're rebuilding that unity. We're overcoming the division. And the question is whether we're ready this time. Whether we've learned enough through our separation to handle unity responsibly, or whether we're going to build our tower and reach for capabilities we can't control and face another intervention, another scattering, another reset. There's genetic engineering happening right now that parallels what the Watchers did. CRISPR technology allowing us to edit DNA with precision. Scientists creating designer babies with selected traits. Chimera research mixing human cells with animal embryos. And it's controversial. It's heavily regulated. Because we recognize instinctively that we're approaching a line. That genetic modification of humans is dangerous territory. And maybe that instinct is inherited memory. Maybe it's genetic trauma from the last time this happened. From when the Watchers created the Nephilim and contaminated the human genome so badly that a global flood was required to eliminate the corruption. And we're approaching that capability again. We're on the verge of being able to modify ourselves, to create new species, to cross boundaries that maybe shouldn't be crossed. And the only thing stopping us is ethics, is collective agreement that some knowledge is too dangerous to apply, even if we have it. And that restraint, that wisdom, maybe that's what we gained from being scattered. Maybe that's what we learned through the division. And maybe that's why this convergence is different from last time. Picture the moment from a higher perspective, from outside, from how the watchers, or whoever is watching us now, might see it. You see a species that was designed, contaminated, reset, scattered, tested, and now reunifying. You see knowledge that was taught, forgotten, preserved, encoded, and now being rediscovered. You see a timeline 7,000 years long from flood to now that looks like an education program, a long, slow training process, and you see humanity approaching a threshold, the moment when students potentially graduate, when the training wheels come off, when we're given the final exam. Do we have the wisdom to handle the knowledge we've gained? Can we be trusted with genetic engineering and artificial intelligence and quantum computing and all the other capabilities we're developing? Or are we still the violent, contaminated species that required a flood? And this moment, this convergence, this is the test. This is where we find out what we are and what we're capable of becoming. So what does it mean that we're living at the convergence point? That ancient knowledge and modern science are meeting and recognizing each other? That the timeline is completing? That the scattering is reversing? That we're finally able to understand what our ancestors preserved? Maybe it means we're approaching graduation. Maybe the long education is ending, and we're being given the opportunity to stand on our own, to use the knowledge responsibly, to prove we've matured beyond the violence and corruption that required our ancestors to be scattered. Or maybe it means we're approaching another test, another moment when we'll have to choose between wisdom and power, between restraint and capability, between being responsible stewards of knowledge or reckless children playing with forces we don't understand. And the choice is ours. It's always been ours. That's the whole point of the scattering. We were separated so we could develop free will, so we could choose independently what kind of species we want to be. And maybe that's the deepest truth in all of this. Maybe the timeline isn't about control, it's about freedom. We were designed, yes. We were engineered, yes. But then we were released, scattered, given space to grow without constant supervision, given the chance to rediscover knowledge at our own pace, to develop our own cultures and perspectives and approaches to truth. And now we're coming back together, bringing all that diversity with us, all those different ways of seeing and thinking and being. And maybe that's the gift. Maybe the scattering wasn't punishment, but preparation, making us richer, deeper, more resilient than we would have been if we'd stayed unified. And now we're reunifying, but we're not the same. We're better. We're stronger. We're ready. Or at least we have the potential to be ready if we choose wisdom over power, if we choose unity over division, if we choose to honor what our ancestors preserved instead of weaponizing it. The weight of this choice sits in your chest, heavy but not crushing, because weight can be strength if you learn to carry it. And maybe that's what the whole timeline has been teaching us. How to carry the weight of knowledge, how to bear the responsibility of capability, how to be worthy of the inheritance our ancestors preserved through flood and scattering and millennia of careful transmission. And now it's our turn, our moment, our choice, and the convergence is waiting. The laboratory is quiet now. The machines have finished their sequencing, the data is processed, the results are displayed, and you're looking at your own genetic code on the screen, seeing the traces of archaic DNA, the mystery genes that don't fit the tree, the chromosome fusion that makes you human. And you're thinking about the journey you've taken through 7 chapters, from the heavenly tablets describing creation before the beginning, through the 22 works that sound like terraforming,
through the Watchers descending and teaching and contaminating, through the flood that reset everything, through the division of Earth and the scattering at Babel, through the bloodline that preserved knowledge from Abraham to Moses, and now here, now this moment when it all comes together, when ancient text and modern science shake hands and recognize each other, and you realize this isn't the end, this is the beginning. Because understanding where we came from is only meaningful if it changes where we're going, if it affects the choices we make, if it gives us wisdom to navigate the threshold we're approaching. And that's the final question, the one this entire timeline has been leading toward. Now that we know, now that the veil is lifting, now that we understand we're hybrid, scattered, tested, reunifying. Now, what do we do with that knowledge? Do we repeat the mistakes of the Watchers? Do we contaminate ourselves again with genetic experiments we can't control? Do we build our towers and reach for power without wisdom? Or do we choose differently? Do we prove we've learned? Do we show that the scattering worked, that the education succeeded, that we're ready for whatever comes next?
Whether that's contact with whoever designed us, or graduation to the next level, or simply the responsibility of becoming our own teachers, our own guides, our own watchers for the next species that needs help. The convergence is complete, the timeline is revealed, and the choice is yours. Not just yours individually, but ours collectively, humanity standing at the threshold between what we were and what we could become. And the only way forward is through. The only way to know if we're ready is to try. And maybe that's the final lesson. Maybe courage is the last thing the timeline teaches. The willingness to step into the unknown, carrying everything we've learned, trusting that the preparation was enough, that we're enough, that we're ready, even if we don't feel ready, because ready or not, the moment is here. The convergence has happened, and what we do next writes the next chapter, not of the hidden timeline, but of the revealed future. And it starts now, with you, with this knowledge, with this choice. So choose well, choose wisely, choose with the weight of 7 millennia on your shoulders and the hope of 7 millennia more in your heart. You're standing at the end of a journey that began before the beginning, and now you've traveled through 7,000 years of hidden timeline, from the heavenly tablets written before creation, through the 22 works that sound like planetary engineering, through Watchers descending to teach and contaminate, through a global flood that reset everything, through Earth divided and humanity scattered at Babel, through the bloodline preserving knowledge from Abraham to Moses, and finally here, to this convergence moment when ancient text and modern science shake hands and recognize each other. And the question burning in your mind isn't whether this timeline is real. The evidence speaks too loudly for doubt. The question is, what do you do now? Now that you know? Now that the veil has lifted? Now that you understand human history is stranger and more complex than either religion or science alone admits. Here's what you've learned that changes everything. We're not purely products of random evolution, and we're not purely divine creation from nothing. We're something in between. We're engineered. We're hybrid. We carry genetics from 2 sources, Earth and sky. And that dual inheritance is written in our DNA, in the mystery genes that don't fit the evolutionary tree, in the chromosome fusion that makes us unique among primates, in the population bottleneck that nearly erased us 12,000 years ago, and we're the survivors, the descendants of the family that made it through catastrophe. And we carry in ourselves and our stories the memory of almost extinction. And maybe that memory is why we build and destroy and build again, why we can't stop reaching for the stars, why we look up and wonder if someone is looking back. Because part of us remembers. Part of us knows we came from 2 worlds, not one, and we're still trying to figure out what that makes us. And here's the practical truth that matters right now in your life.
You're not a victim of this origin. You're empowered by understanding it. Because now you can see the divisions that separate us, race and nation and language and religion, and recognize them for what they are, artificial barriers imposed at Babel to keep us scattered until we were ready to reunify. And we're overcoming those barriers now, through technology, through global communication, through translation and shared knowledge. And that's not accident. That's the timeline completing. That's the scattering reversing. That's humanity finding its way back to unity. And the question is whether we're ready this time, whether we've learned enough through our separation to handle unity wisely, whether we'll use our knowledge to elevate or to dominate, to heal or to harm. And that choice belongs to you, to all of us, to every person who carries this awareness and decides what to do with it. So here's what I'm asking you to do. If this journey has shifted something in you, if you see connections now you didn't see before, if ancient mystery feels less mysterious and more like memory, then hit the like button on this video, because that tells me you're ready to go deeper. It tells me there are others who want to know what's been hidden, and it helps this message reach people who need to hear it, people who are searching for answers that mainstream narratives can't provide. And save this video, bookmark it, because you'll want to return to it. You'll want to trace the timeline again when new evidence emerges, when genetics discovers something else that confirms what Jubilees recorded, when archaeology unearths another impossible structure that matches the pattern we've been tracking. And subscribe to this channel, because this is only the beginning. This is part 1 of 50 journeys into the hidden timeline, and what comes next goes even deeper into the mysteries we've only begun to explore. Because here's what we didn't fully answer in this episode. Who were the Watchers really? Where did they come from? What happened to them after the flood? And here's the question that should keep you awake tonight. If some Watchers were bound and imprisoned as Jubilees describes, are they still imprisoned? Are they still here? And what about their offspring, the Nephilim, the giants, the hybrids who walked the earth before the flood? Jubilees hints that not all of them died, that some survived, that the contamination persisted even after the reset. And there are stories, ancient stories from every culture, about giants, about beings of enormous size and strength who lived among humans, who built the megalithic structures we can't explain, who became the heroes and demigods of mythology. And there's evidence, skeletal evidence, graves containing remains of individuals 7, 8, 9 feet tall. Findings that mainstream archaeology dismisses or ignores because they don't fit the approved narrative. But the evidence exists. It's documented. It's real. So here's what's coming in the next episode. We're going back before the flood, back to the moment when 200 Watchers stood on Mount Hermon and made their oath. And we're going to investigate who they really were. We're going to trace their names, their teachings, their offspring. We're going to look at what happened to the Nephilim bloodline, whether it was truly eliminated in the flood or whether it survived in hidden pockets, in isolated populations, in the giants that appear in biblical text after the flood. Goliath, the Anakim, the Rephaim, beings who shouldn't exist if the reset was complete. And we're going to ask the hardest question. If Watcher genetics survived, if Nephilim bloodlines persisted, then are they still here? Are there families, lineages, groups who carry more of the hybrid DNA than the rest of us, who have access to knowledge and capabilities that seem almost superhuman? And is that why certain bloodlines have maintained power across centuries, why certain families appear again and again in positions of influence? And I know this sounds like conspiracy theory, but what if conspiracy is just pattern recognition that makes people uncomfortable? What if the real conspiracy is pretending the patterns don't exist? In the next episode, titled The Watchers, The Mystery of Fallen Angels and the Giant Bloodline Before the Flood, we're going to uncover evidence that will make everything we discussed today look tame by comparison. We're going to show you artifacts they don't display in museums, skeletal remains they won't carbon date,
Ancient texts describing the Watchers in detail that makes them sound less like angels and more like scientists, genetic engineers, teachers who broke protocol and paid the price. And we're going to trace what happened to their children, to the Nephilim, who the Bible says were mighty men of old, men of renown. And we're going to ask whether renown means famous or infamous, whether mighty means powerful or dangerous. And we're going to let you decide whether the flood was divine judgment or biological quarantine, whether the elimination of the giants was moral necessity or genetic reset. So leave a comment right now. Tell me what you think the next episode will reveal. What's your theory about the Watchers? Do you think they were extraterrestrial, interdimensional, time travelers, or remnants of a previous terrestrial civilization? Do you think the Nephilim were literal giants or symbolic representations of something else? Do you think any of their bloodline survived? And if so, where would you look for evidence? Comment your theories, your questions, your thoughts. Because this isn't just me talking at you. This is a conversation. This is a community of people who refuse to accept simple answers to complex questions, who are willing to look at evidence even when it's uncomfortable, who understand that truth is more important than comfort. The journey ends here, but the mystery continues. The timeline is revealed, but new questions emerge. And if you've come this far, if you've stayed curious through 7 chapters of evidence and correlation and revelation, then you're exactly the kind of person who needs to see what comes next. So, subscribe, like, save, comment, and I'll see you in the next journey, where we meet the Watchers face to face, where we walk among giants, where we explore the bloodline that almost destroyed humanity and might still be here, hidden in plain sight. The convergence is complete, but the story is just beginning, and you're part of it now. Thank you for your courage. Thank you for your curiosity. Thank you for choosing to see what's been hidden. I'll be waiting for you in the next episode, on the other side of mystery, where the real secrets live.